Hello friends. Before we start the video, I really need your support. The channel is going through a tough time and your help would mean a lot. If you're watching this video right now, please hit the like button, leave any comment, and support the video. If everyone watching does this, it would really help me. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. My name is Dakota Whitmore, and I accepted a 3-month seasonal position as a backcountry ranger at Glacier National Park because I was running from something worse than whatever the wilderness could throw at me. A divorce that left me hollow, a department that no longer wanted me after I filed a complaint about harassment that went nowhere, and an apartment in Missoula where every corner reminded me of someone I used to be. The federal government's hiring process moved slowly, but when they contacted me in early August, I didn't hesitate. They needed someone experienced, willing to work remote sections of the park, someone who wouldn't mind the isolation. I had 10 years with the National Park Service by then, most of that time split between Yellowstone and smaller assignments. I knew bears and weather patterns. I knew how to read people in crisis, how to keep the panic out of my voice when calling in emergencies. I was good at my job, even if the institution didn't value the parts of me that mattered most. The cabin sat at the terminus of Belly River, 3 miles from the nearest trail junction, accessible only by hiking or horseback. No cell service, a radio for emergencies, though the battery indicator was already flickering amber when I arrived in late August. The structure itself was older than I expected. 1970s construction, wooden walls weathered to the color of old bone, a metal roof that groaned when the wind picked up. They'd stocked it with supplies, canned goods, first aid equipment, emergency rations meant to last 2 weeks. But the pantry behind the kitchen held things left by previous rangers, their expiration dates sometimes pushing back into the previous decade. The job description was straightforward: conduct daily patrols, maintain the trail system, respond to emergency calls, keep detailed logs. In practice, this meant hours alone. The Park Service had cut back on staff during budget cycles that seemed to span most of the last decade. The rangers who used to split rotation had been transferred, retired, or simply quit. I became the only federal presence in a region that covered roughly 40 square miles of high-altitude wilderness. I set up on a Thursday, unpacked my personal items, photographs I should have thrown away, books I'd read a dozen times, a sleeping bag that smelled like campfire from a life I'd mostly forgotten. The elevation at the cabin was 4,600 feet, high enough that the mornings were sharp and bright, cutting through the valley with the kind of clarity you don't find anywhere else. The sunsets took 40 minutes sometimes, the light bending through clean air, painting the glacial peaks in colors that looked unreal. That first week was good. I hiked every trail system in the district, reacquainted myself with the topography, documented trail conditions, and replaced 2 missing directional signs that had probably been taken by visitors who wanted souvenirs. I saw mule deer on the ridge trail, a grizzly from what I estimated was 400 yards away, and a porcupine that made its displeasure with my presence very clear by rattling its quills. The solitude felt like medicine. On the evening of day 5, I was preparing dinner, freeze-dried stroganoff, hydrated with water from the cistern, when I heard the sound of hooves on the trail above the cabin. Park rangers sometimes passed through on horseback, checking on backcountry campsites. I went outside, expecting to see one of them. The approaching sound was wrong, though. The rhythm was off, too irregular, with occasional pauses that suggested the animal was moving deliberately rather than maintaining a steady pace. The horse that eventually appeared from the tree line was gray, its coat matted and dark with what might have been sweat or something else. It stopped when it saw me, head raised, and for a moment we both stood motionless. No saddle, no tack. The animal's left ear seemed to be at a wrong angle, bent inward as if the cartilage had softened. Its eyes caught the fading light and reflected nothing back, just empty sockets of dark. Then it moved. Not toward me, but parallel to the cabin, traveling along the eastern face at an uneven gait. I watched it until the trees obscured my view, then went back inside and locked the door. A reasonable precaution. Wild horses had been found in the park before, escaped from private ranches in the valleys below. The internet connection was non-existent at the cabin, but I made a note in my log: 8:28, 1847 hours, unusual horse sighting, gray coloring, moving northeast on upper trail system. The next morning, I walked the area where I'd seen the animal, looking for hoof prints. The ground was dry and hard, and any track that might have existed was erased by the seasonal winds that swept the valley with enough force to knock you sideways if you weren't careful. I told myself I'd probably misidentified what I saw. Dehydration at altitude makes people see things differently. The light in that part of the valley was strange anyway. Something about the angle of the surrounding peaks meant that twilight lasted longer up here than elsewhere. That rationalization held up until I found the hoofprints at the lake. Belly River fed into a glacial lake about a mile northeast of the cabin, the water so cold that immersion was a medical emergency measured in minutes. The lake bottom was visible for 20 feet out, stone and gravel, impossibly clear, and the water's color was that impossible blue that only exists at high altitude with glacial melt. I went to the lake most days to check on the campsites scattered along its southern shore. Mostly they were empty. The camping season was winding down, and early September meant most casual hikers had given up on the mountains. The hoofprints were there on the western shore, near where the water pooled and stilled before tumbling into the river. They were deep, carved with significant force into the earth, and they went into the water. They didn't emerge on the other side. The prints simply ended, the path disappearing beneath the surface, and there was nothing on the near shore to suggest the animal had turned around and left the way it came. I photographed the prints with my agency-issued digital camera. The images were clear enough to show detail, the shoe marks from whatever shoes the animal wore in its previous life. The spread of the hooves, there were no other animals nearby, no carcass in the water. Just the prints ending in the water, and nothing beyond them but cold blue depth. I radioed it in to the nearest station in St. Mary's, down at the eastern edge of the park. The dispatcher, a woman named Rebecca who I'd met twice in person and spoken with maybe a dozen times on the radio, offered possible explanations. Animal in distress. Equipment failure. Maybe it hadn't reached the other side before I passed. Photographic artifact. She was professionally skeptical, which I appreciated because I needed her to be. My own skepticism was wearing thin. That night, I made the mistake of stepping outside around midnight for air. The sky that high up, away from ambient light, holds more stars than most people realize existed. I was standing at the cabin's edge, looking up, when I heard the sound. Not the horse this time, something else. Something that approximated a human voice, but built on a framework that wasn't quite right. It started as something like a call, stretched across the valley, and contained words underneath the animal sounds. I heard my name mixed in there. Coda, 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 layered beneath something that might have been singing or might have been the sound of something in pain. I was inside with the door locked before I finished hearing it. I sat at the kitchen table, my heart working at a pace that made me dizzy, and tried to convince myself that wind makes strange sounds in mountains. Wind tunnels through valleys. Wind screams around stone. Wind can sound like anything if you're tired and alone and predisposed to hearing voices and noise. But wind doesn't call you by name, and I was certain, sitting there in the dark cabin, that the sound had used my name with intention. The next morning brought rain and fog that compressed the world to about 50 yards of visibility. The kind of weather that made the mountains feel less like geographic features and more like something alive and pressing in on you. I did my usual perimeter check, found nothing of note except the continuing strangeness of the hoofprints. They had somehow become more defined overnight, as if something had retraced them, deepening the impressions. The work of a backcountry ranger is often mundane. Trail maintenance, equipment inspection, weather logs, incident reports. I threw myself into the mundane with the intensity of someone refusing to examine the cracks in their foundation. I spent 2 days improving drainage on the northern switchback. I repaired a broken sign that had been damaged by a falling branch. I reorganized the supply shed and inventoried the first aid kit. On day 9, I received a radio call from a group of backpackers attempting to summit Mount Simpson from the north approach. They'd made better time than expected and were now dealing with what their group leader described as unusual weather conditions and visibility issues. The elevation at the summit was 10,751 feet. The Weather Service was forecasting a frontal system moving through the region by evening. I advised them to descend, offered to mark their path if they reached the Ridge Camp shelter before dark. They reached the shelter at 4:13 p.m. according to my log. 7 individuals, 5 in their 60s, 2 younger adults they identified as family members. I spoke briefly with their group leader, a man named Victor, who assured me they had equipment for overnight camping and weren't concerned about the system. They'd done this before. I could hear the confidence in his voice that comes from years of outdoor experience without encountering anything dangerous. The mountains, they believe, follow rules. Elevation gain is hard but predictable. Weather is observable and can be avoided. Wildlife follows understood patterns. I had thought the same way once. The storm moved in faster than predicted. By 5:30 p.m. I was getting wind readings off the cabin's anemometer that exceeded 40 miles per hour, with gusts pushing past 60. I ran through the communication protocol, radio contact with Ridge Camp, confirmation they were secure, advising them of the deteriorating conditions. Victor's voice on the return transmission had changed. The confidence had been replaced by something sharper. They were secure, he said, but the group was reporting sounds around the shelter. Large animals, probably. They'd secure the food and maintain watch. I told him to keep the radio on. I would monitor the frequency throughout the night. The wind made the cabin creak in ways that suggested the structure had developed an increasing number of fractures since the morning. I made coffee and settled into the uncomfortable chair by the radio, waiting for updates that didn't come. Not because Victor wasn't trying. I could hear him making periodic contact attempts at 8:42 p.m., 9:15 p.m., and 10:03 p.m., each call growing more insistent. At 10:47, I was receiving his transmissions, but my outgoing signal wasn't reaching them. Equipment failure or atmospheric conditions. The mountains made reliable radio communication probabilistic rather than guaranteed. I tried again at regular intervals. By 1 a.m., I'd accepted that I wouldn't be reaching them until morning. They had shelter. They had experience. The storm would pass. At 2:15 a.m., I heard the voice again. This time, it didn't come through the radio. It came through the walls themselves, or so it seemed. The words were different, but they followed the same construction. My name wrapped around other sounds, asking questions that almost made sense. Where are you, Coda? Why are you here, Coda? The storm makes such beautiful music, doesn't it, Coda? The last phrase stretched across nearly 10 seconds, the word music fracturing into something that held undertones of what might have been violin strings or might have been wind across metal. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the emergency flare gun on the table in front of me, knowing with the rational part of my mind that a flare gun was the wrong tool for whatever was happening, but needing something in my hands anyway. The weather cleared around dawn. I was out and moving toward Ridge Camp as soon as there was enough light to navigate the trail safely. The distance was 3 miles up moderate elevation. I should have made it in 90 minutes. But I took my time, listening to everything, ready to turn back. Ridge Camp is a shelter structure built in the 1980s. Concrete foundation, wooden frame walls, metal roof. It's designed to sleep about 12 people comfortably, with benches arranged in 3 rows. The Park Service maintains it as a wilderness resource, not a hotel. No heat, no water source nearby. The nearest pristine water was a quarter-mile down the eastern slope. When I arrived, the door was still closed. The structure appeared undamaged. There was no obvious emergency. I approached slowly, listening for voices or movement. The smell hit me when I was still 20 feet away. Not the smell of decomposition. I'd smelled death before and recognized it. This was something else. Wet animal hide, something like rust, and underneath it, something that reminded me of the exhaust from an old diesel engine, thick and chemical. The door opened easily. I expected to find the worst. What I found was worse than death. Because it was absence. The shelter was empty. The sleeping bags and packs that should have been there were gone. The footprints on the floor, and there were many of them, crisscrossing in patterns that made no logical sense, led nowhere. They started and stopped randomly. Some were human, some were not. The pattern suggested movement, but not the movement of people trying to organize themselves. Something more chaotic, something more frantic. I found one object, a watch, a Timex with a dark leather band, on the concrete floor near the entrance. I recognized it from the brief description Victor had given when he mentioned his group. The face was cracked. The time had stopped at 2:47. I radioed it in. A missing persons situation in a remote area. 7 individuals. Last contact at 10:47 p.m. the previous evening. I secured the shelter, maintained the scene, and waited for the helicopter that wouldn't arrive until the following day due to weather. They sent a ground team from the nearest ranger station, 3 rangers and a SAR coordinator who all looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. They searched. They found nothing except more of those illogical prints, the kind of tracks that animals don't make, that people don't make, that nothing in nature should make. The search expanded. Park Service helicopters, volunteer search and rescue teams, dogs that refused to follow any scent trail beyond a 50-yard radius from the shelter. After 4 days, the official position became that the group had likely disoriented in the storm, possibly attempted to descend in bad visibility, and encountered an accident. The SAR coordinator explained this to me with the exhaustion of someone who knew it wasn't true but had to offer an explanation to families who wanted closure. I left my position 3 weeks early. The reasons I gave were clinical, family emergency, unforeseen circumstances, incompatible living conditions. The real reason I stayed those 3 weeks was that I couldn't leave without trying to understand what had happened. The real reason I finally left was that understanding was becoming possible, and I wasn't sure I could live with what I was beginning to comprehend. Those final weeks in the cabin took on a quality that I struggled to describe in my journal. The mundane continued, trail maintenance, weather logs, supply inventories, but underneath everything was a waiting. I was waiting for something, and I knew that something was waiting for me. The sounds became more frequent. Not just the voice, though, that continued, but other things. There were howls that didn't match anything I could identify with any known animal. There were impacts against the cabin walls at night, something large and heavy testing the structure. I reinforced the door with a beam I'd found in the outbuildings, and I started sleeping with every light in the cabin on, draining batteries at a rate that wasn't sustainable but felt necessary for survival. One evening, while doing a routine patrol of the northern section, I found an area of disturbed ground that hadn't been there the previous day. The trees surrounding it had been marked, not naturally, but deliberately, with bark stripped in patterns that created deliberate symbols. The marks weren't fresh, but they weren't ancient either. Something between weeks and months old. They covered an area of maybe 200 square yards. In the center, the earth had been disturbed, turned over, and there were partial prints there. Boot prints maybe, but twisted in ways that suggested the foot pressing them was flexible in directions feet shouldn't be flexible. I photographed everything. My documentation was becoming obsessive. I was filling the incident logs with observations that the Park Service would eventually classify as unreliable, the writings of someone experiencing altitude sickness or psychological stress. I knew this as I was writing it, and I couldn't stop. The logs were my attempt to create a record that might outlast my own credibility. The second encounter with another person came on day 19. I was hiking back from the northern trails, carrying equipment I'd been repairing, when I saw a person on the trail ahead of me. My immediate reaction was confusion. I'd had no indication that anyone had registered with the park for backcountry camping in my district. The person was standing perfectly still, positioned right in the middle of the trail, and as I approached, they turned to face me. For a moment I didn't recognize him, then the details assembled themselves. It was one of the backpackers from Ridge Camp. The younger one. I'd heard him introduced as Marcus, one of the family members. His clothes were the same ones he'd been wearing during my radio check-in, and they showed no signs of 9 days of exposure, no tearing, no dirt. They looked as if they'd been recently cleaned. I spoke his name. He didn't respond. He simply watched me, his head cocked at a slight angle, the way a bird cocks its head when observing something that might be food or might be threat. I asked him where the others were. He opened his mouth, and I heard the now familiar layering of sounds. Words struggling to be born inside something that wasn't designed to produce human speech. My name was in there again, stretched across impossible consonants. I'm not sure who moved first. I think I did, backing up. And then he moved toward me with a speed that human muscles shouldn't produce, and I was running. I was moving down the trail with a panic I'd never experienced before, my mind narrowing to the singular focus of getting back to the cabin. I didn't look back. I could hear him behind me. That's what I'll always remember, the sound of something that couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. Not quite running like a human, not quite moving like an animal, but moving with purpose and with knowledge of the terrain that suggested he'd been learning it over those 9 days. I made it to the cabin. I got inside. I locked everything that could be locked. For 3 hours, I waited for him to arrive, waited for impacts against the walls, but nothing came. The thing that might have been Marcus simply stopped coming. When I finally looked out the window, the trail was empty. That night I submitted my resignation over the radio, effective immediately. I said I had a family emergency. I said the position wasn't working out. I didn't mention the thing wearing Marcus's face because there was no way to mention it without erasing every shred of professional credibility I had left. They accepted my resignation with minimal argument. A supply drop was already scheduled for the next day. A replacement ranger would arrive in a week to pack up the cabin and close the station for winter. I could leave with the supply drop if I needed to. The flight out was supposed to take 40 minutes. I sat in the small plane next to the pilot, a cheerful woman in her 50s who asked minimal questions and seemed content with my explanation of family issues. As we climbed out of the valley, I looked down at the landscape I'd been living in for the past month. The cabin was a small rectangle of dark wood against green forest. The lake was a brilliant blue eye staring up at nothing. The trails were threads of lighter color connecting points of importance, and from above they seemed to spell out a pattern. But by the time the plane banked and the perspective shifted, I couldn't see it anymore. Something about that lost pattern bothered me more than everything else combined. Once I was back in Missoula, in the temporary apartment I'd rented, I began to research, not casually, with the focus of someone trying to prove something to herself. I pulled Park Service reports going back 15 years, missing persons in the backcountry, incidents that hadn't been fully explained, ranger reports that had been flagged as potentially unreliable due to psychological factors. The data assembled itself into a pattern that shouldn't exist. Between 2008 and the present, there had been 17 documented incidents involving missing persons in remote areas of Glacier National Park. Of the 17 individuals, 12 had been found. Of the 12 found, 10 had been essentially intact, bodies recovered, causes of death attributable to exposure or accidents, but 2 of the 12 had been found alive, wandering, with memory gaps measured in weeks and physical conditions that defied explanation. 1 had been found near the base of a cliff he couldn't have fallen from based on his injuries. The other had been walking down the Going to the Sun road at 3 a.m., moving in the wrong direction, insisting that he needed to return to a place he'd never been. The 5 individuals never found. They had all been in remote sections of the park, far from developed trails and emergency services. 1 had disappeared in 2009, a geology student doing field research in the Belly River area. The incident report was brief. Student had departed for a solo survey and failed to return. Search efforts had found no trace. I pulled the photo. A young man named Derek Weistone, 22 years old, from Bozeman. The photo was from his university faculty page. He looked alive in a way that most missing persons photos don't. He was smiling, caught mid-laugh, and there was an ease in his posture that suggested a person who didn't know he was running out of time. I found his social media archived on a cached version of a site that no longer existed. His last post, dated 2 days before his disappearance, contained a photo of the Belly River Valley taken from the high meadows. The post read, "Something strange here, beautiful but strange. The valley seems to know things. I'll post more when I figure out what I'm seeing." There was no more post. There was only Derek, missing, and then the historical record moving on. I spent 3 days compiling the data. I created spreadsheets. I mapped coordinates. I noted dates and times and weather conditions. And when I was done, I had something that the Park Service didn't have, or had but refused to see, a geographic hotspot, a concentration of incidents, all clustered around the remote areas accessible from the cabin I'd just fled. The second pattern was harder to see but harder to deny once I saw it. The sounds. I found Reddit posts, no sleep submissions, obscure outdoor forums, all describing similar vocalizations, something that called people by name, something that used language in a way that suggested intelligence but wrong intelligence. The descriptions were scattered across years and different parks, but the acoustic qualities were identical. That layering of sounds, that struggle to produce human speech from something that didn't have the hardware for it, and the transformation. 7 missing from Ridge Camp, and 1 week later, something in Marcus's skin, walking the trails with knowledge it shouldn't have possessed. The pattern suggested that the missing persons weren't dead. They were being worn, or occupied, or transformed into something that could move through the park using the shape of people as a template. I didn't have a name for what was happening. I didn't have an explanation that fit into any framework of science or medicine, but I had a certainty that was absolute. Something in that valley was alive in a way that couldn't be categorized, and it was learning from the people it consumed or converted. I left Missoula on a Tuesday morning, driving northwest toward the mountains. I'd spent the intervening weeks thinking about why I was making this choice. The rational explanations were thin. I needed closure. I needed to warn someone, anyone with evidence they couldn't dismiss. I needed to see if what I remembered was real or if altitude had scrambled my brain into accepting horror as fact. The real reason was that I was becoming aware of something in myself that felt like obligation. The people in that valley didn't have voices anymore. Their stories had been interrupted, rewritten, consumed into something else. The least I could offer them was witness. The least I could do was try to understand. I hiked in from the nearest trailhead, not using the direct route from the cabin. I came up from the north, through high meadows, arriving at the valley rim at dusk. The landscape was the same but different. The light was wrong, not sunset light, but something older, The air had that quality I'd learned to recognize, the sense of being observed not by eyes but by something more fundamental. The landscape itself was aware. I didn't go to the cabin. Instead, I made camp on the high ridge overlooking the valley and the lake, and I waited. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a weapon beyond the emergency flare gun and the knowledge that violence probably wouldn't matter against something like this. Around midnight, it came to me, not in the form I expected. Not as one of the people it had consumed, though those were there too. I could see them in the darkness, moving in the forest below, their movements jerky and synchronized in a way that suggested they were puppets on the same set of strings. It came as something else, something that resembled the shape of a human being but built from components that had been assembled wrong. The proportions were off in subtle ways, the joints bent in directions human joints shouldn't bend. But it was trying. Whatever intelligence inhabited that form was trying very hard to be human, and the effort was visible in every movement, a constant struggle against flesh and bone that wanted to do impossible things. It didn't speak through vocalization. It spoke directly, and I understood it not through my ears but through something deeper. The message was simple and terrible. Why do you fear us? We are not so different. We consume, you consume, we grow, you grow. We are evolution, and you are the old form, the template we are learning to improve upon. I understood then what I was witnessing. Not an invasion, not really. An adaptation, something in this world that had learned to see humans not as threats but as blueprints, as instructions for what it might become. And it was patient, it was hungry, it was learning. I fired the flare gun. I don't know why. It was an instinctive gesture, the desperate act of someone who had no actual defense. The flare rose into the darkness, and for a moment everything stopped. The thing in the human shape went perfectly still. The puppets in the forest below froze in their jerky movements. Then I ran. I ran because I'd accomplished what I came to do. I'd seen it, I'd witnessed it, I'd tried to understand it. And I understood that understanding wasn't going to help anyone. What was needed was evacuation, containment, or something we didn't have words for yet. I made it to the trailhead as dawn was breaking. I was out of the mountains by noon. I drove to the ranger station in St. Mary's and filed a report so detailed, so complete in its accounting of impossible things, that it took them exactly 4 hours to flag my psychological evaluation for mandatory review. That was 6 months ago. I haven't returned to the mountains. The official investigation found nothing at the cabin beyond signs of long-term habitation and some unusual animal tracks that didn't match anything in their database. The missing backpackers remain missing. Derek Whitestone remains missing. Marcus remains missing, or what was wearing Marcus remains missing. But I see them sometimes. Not in person. In photographs. In video files that shouldn't exist. In social media posts that appear and disappear. I'll see Marcus in a crowd at a ski resort, just barely visible in the background of someone else's vacation photo. I'll see Derek walking across a university campus in a city far from Montana. I'll see people I don't recognize, moving with that familiar slight wrongness, and I'll know they're also missing. They're still learning. They're still trying to be human. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear the sounds. The voices layered with other things. The struggle to produce human speech from something that isn't designed for it. They're closer now, though I'm far from the mountains. The distance doesn't matter. Whatever it is, wherever it is, it's been learning how to reach further. I don't know what comes next. I don't know if this is the end or the beginning. But I know that in a valley in Glacier National Park, something is growing more skilled at wearing human skin every day. And I know that one day someone will hike into those mountains without understanding what lives there. They'll go looking for solitude and find something older, something patient, something that has watched humans long enough to know exactly how to call them deeper into the wild, and it will learn more. The mountains, I've come to understand, are hungry, and they are never ever satisfied. My name is Macdonald, and I took this job because I needed to disappear, not in the romantic sense that city people imagine when they talk about running away to nature. I needed to vanish in a practical sense, the way smoke disappears into open sky. After the accident at the university where I worked as a botanist, after the lawsuit that wasn't my fault but felt like it was, after 6 months of seeing my own face on comment threads dedicated to my failure, I understood that some mistakes don't wash away, they calcify. They become part of your permanent record, the thing people see before they see you. The Glacier National Park Ranger position came up 3 years ago. Remote assignment to the Gunsight Pass region, a sector that covered nearly 40 square miles of alpine meadow, dense forest, and the kind of isolation that makes most people anxious. The cabin sat 2 miles from the nearest maintained trail, accessible only by foot or the old snowcat during winter months. The job posting made it clear they wanted someone who didn't mind being alone, who had wilderness medicine certification, who wouldn't panic if emergency response times stretched into hours instead of minutes. It sounded like mercy. I drove north through Montana in March, the landscape opening up from organized farmland into something wilder and less predictable. My supervisor, a man named Cordell with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 40 years outdoors, gave me the tour of the ranger station where I'd spend roughly 4 days per week. The other 3 days I'd be at the cabin, doing the solitary work that keeps a national park running: trail maintenance, wildlife surveys, water quality checks, and watching for signs of trouble. Trouble meant different things in different seasons. In spring it meant hikers underprepared for the rapid temperature swings. In summer it meant lost backpackers and the occasional bear encounter. Fall brought hunters who ventured beyond park boundaries. Winter meant almost nobody, which was precisely what I wanted. How often do you get visitors out to Gunsight? I asked Cordell as we stood on the cabin's small porch. It was early April, snow still heavy on the peaks. Not many make it that far. Maybe 50-60 people a year in the warm season. Most stick to the main valleys. He handed me a metal container with emergency supplies. Flare gun, first aid, satellite communicator. You'll spend more time with elk than people. That's the point, yeah? That was exactly the point. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd expected from the photographs, maybe 12 feet by 20. But it had a wood stove, propane for cooking, and large windows that faced a pristine alpine lake. Macdonald Lake, the maps called it. The water was the color of compressed snow, fed by glacial melt, so cold that exposure would kill you in minutes. The terrain around it was steep enough that few trails led there. The isolation was absolute. I spent my first weeks learning the rhythms of the place, the way light moved across the valley, the sound of the wind at different speeds, the patterns of the wildlife, the trails that predators used, the spots where hikers were likely to get into trouble. I documented 3 families of bighorn sheep, a population of mountain goats that seemed unusually healthy, and signs of a moose that had wandered higher than they typically do. The work was repetitive and grounding. My hands became calloused from trail work. My lungs expanded in the thin air. The first time I made it through a full week without thinking about the lawsuit, I felt something close to joy. Summer arrived early that year. By mid-June, the snow was mostly gone except on the highest peaks, and the trails through my sector became busier. I maintained order in my small kingdom, warning a group of rock climbers about unstable faces near Stimson Ridge, helping a family with a twisted ankle make it back to the parking area, checking on backcountry campers to ensure they were following bear safety protocols. None of it seemed dangerous. The wilderness has a reputation for menace that's largely unearned. Most danger comes from human error and poor preparation. And when the wilderness itself shows its teeth, it does so with such clear warning signs that only the willfully ignorant ignore them. But there was something odd about the region that summer, something I couldn't quite articulate to anyone, so I didn't try. The animals were behaving strangely, not aggressively but unnaturally aware. I'd see elk standing on open slopes in the middle of the day when they should have been bedded down in the timber. The birds seemed to follow me along certain sections of trail, circling above rather than fleeing. On 3 separate occasions, I found large paw prints that matched no known animal in the region. When I brought this up to Cordell, he dismissed it as bear activity, even though the prints were wrong, the size and shape belonging to something that didn't exist in any official wildlife handbook. By late July, I'd been at the cabin for 4 months. I felt like I'd aged a decade. The person who arrived in March felt like someone else entirely. I'd stopped checking my email. I'd stopped reading the news. I existed in a smaller world defined by elevation lines and tree coverage, and it suited me perfectly. Then came the first call. It wasn't a voice at first. I woke near midnight to what sounded like a young voice calling from somewhere near the lake. Help! Can someone help me? I was out of bed instantly, adrenaline sharp and bright. A lost hiker, probably. I grabbed my radio, my flashlight, and moved toward the window. The lake surface was dark, unreadable. The voice came again, definitely a child's voice, definitely in distress. I was radioing dispatch before I was fully dressed. Macdonald to base. I have a possible lost person near Gunsight Lake. Sounds like a juvenile. Possible emergency. Copy, came the static-wrapped response. Coordinates of last signal on the north shore, approximately. I'm investigating now. I took my pack with the medical supplies and moved out into the night. The temperature had dropped to near freezing despite it being late July. My breath formed pale ghosts in the beam of my flashlight. I moved along the rocky shore, calling out, listening. The voice came again, clearer now, almost directly across the water from my position. Please someone help, I'm hurt. I know the topography of my sector intimately. The nearest trail on the opposite shore was a technical climb, dangerous even in daylight, and there was no way a child had reached it without rescue, which meant either the voice was coming from somewhere else, or the child was in the water, which was an impossibility. No one survives in Macdonald Lake without a suit. Stay where you are, I called out. I'm coming around. What's your name? The response came immediately, but it wasn't a name. It was the sound of my own voice, young and terrified. Please help me, I'm drowning, please help me. I stopped moving. The wind picked up and I told myself that was what I was hearing. Acoustic tricks, sound bouncing off rock faces and cliff walls distorted into patterns that resembled words. But my hands were shaking and I know the difference between what I wish to be true and what actually is. I made my way around the lake shore, a rough scramble over boulders that took 20 minutes. The whole time I heard that voice. Sometimes mine, sometimes others, sometimes just wordless crying. The sounds were coming from the far side of the lake, from the direction of the cliff face I'd mentioned to dispatch. When I reached the opposite shore, there was nothing. No footprints, no body, no sign of anyone or anything. The water was undisturbed, the air was perfectly still. I called dispatch again. Possible false report, no signs of distressed person. Could be wildlife or acoustic anomaly. Copy. Investigate further or return to base. I stood there shining my flashlight across the empty water and couldn't explain what I'd heard. Returning to base, we'll continue morning sweep, but I didn't sleep. I sat in the cabin and made coffee and watched the darkness until the sun came back. The incident with the voice lingered in my mind like a stubborn infection. I'd worked in wilderness for years. I understood how terrain could deceive sound. I understood auditory hallucinations could occur at altitude with minimal sleep. I understood pattern recognition was a flaw in human neurology, something that made us see meaning in noise and shapes in shadows. I also understood that none of these explanations made what I'd experienced any less disturbing. I continued my work, maintained my routes, processed the experience as best I could. Summer deepened. August brought more hikers, more routine rescues, more of the normal work that kept me anchored to reality. But I started noticing other things, small things. A section of trail near the eastern fork where all the undergrowth had been stripped as if something had walked through and consumed everything in a band exactly 4 feet wide. A campsite I found abandoned with food still cooking on a dying fire. No sign of the campers anywhere, their gear arranged in a circle around the pot as if they'd been looking at it before they vanished. Then came the night I heard it again. Not by the lake this time, but closer, just outside the cabin. It was calling my name. Not Macdonald, but the name I'd had before, the one printed on university documents and newspaper articles. The name attached to my failure, hearing it spoken in that strange, hollow way, as if the speaker was learning how to shape words, how to make sounds approximate human speech, gave me a clarity that genuine sleep never could. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the door, not for protection against animals, the caliber was wrong for that, but for something I couldn't name, for insurance against knowing what was outside. Go away, I shouted through the door. There's no one here to help you. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have texture, as if the night had become solid. Then, from the darkness, came something else. Not words, but a sound like laughter. If laughter could be produced by something that had never quite learned how human anatomy works. A wet, whistling, distorted sound that came from what might have been a throat. I didn't sleep that night either. By September, I'd convinced myself that I was experiencing a mental health crisis. The isolation was profound. The altitude could affect cognition. The original trauma could be resurfacing in the form of auditory hallucinations. I sat in the ranger station one morning and drafted an email to Cordell requesting a transfer, but I never sent it. Because that afternoon something happened that made the situation sharply, unmistakably real. A group of 3 hikers came through the sector, 2 men and 1 woman, experienced outdoors people from their equipment and bearing. They were doing a multi-day loop, camping at designated backcountry sites. I did the routine check, confirmed they had permits, gave them the standard safety briefing. They seemed competent, well-prepared, and they smiled at my warnings about the weather forecast showing possible afternoon thunderstorms. They were found 3 days later, 2 of them at least. The search was coordinated through the ranger station. Cordell came out with 2 search and rescue volunteers, and we followed their planned route. What we found was their camp exactly where they said they'd be staying. Their tent was intact, their food supplies were untouched. Their sleeping bags were laid out in neat rows, the way they'd been arranged when we found them. But the people themselves were gone, not just missing. Removed somehow, taken in a way that left their equipment but not them. The woman was Sarah Valen. I never learned the names of the men because our search became focused entirely on her. She'd been a therapist in Seattle. According to her hiking partner's official statement, she'd gone to collect water from the nearby stream around dusk. She never came back. The search continued for 9 days. Dogs were brought in, helicopters, volunteers from 3 counties. They found her hiking boot at the edge of a ravine, sole worn thin but no body, no other clothing. Just the one boot, placed on a rock as if it had been left there deliberately, a sign for someone to find. The official conclusion was tragic but unsurprising. She'd slipped while gathering water, fallen into the ravine, and her body had been carried away by the stream or buried in the rough terrain. Search and rescue acknowledged that finding remains in that landscape was nearly impossible. The report I filed mentioned nothing of the strangeness I'd seen in their camp, the way the inside of the tent smelled wrong, not like human sweat and nylon, but like something else entirely, something organic and deeply old, something that made my primitive hindbrain scream at me to leave, to run, to get out of those mountains, because I knew what had happened to Sarah Valen. Or at least, I knew that her disappearance was connected to the voices, to the thing that had been learning how to use my name, to whatever was living in the high country of my assigned sector. When Cordell asked me if I wanted to take some time off, I refused. I knew that if I left I would never come back, and some part of me, the part that had run to these mountains to disappear, understood that running a second time would be a capitulation of a different sort. So I stayed, and I started keeping a log of everything unusual. The sounds, the tracks, the areas where animals wouldn't go, the places where the wind moved wrong. I began to suspect that what I was dealing with wasn't a single creature but something more distributed, more networked, something that used voices the way a fisherman uses bait, that could imitate anyone, any sound, anything with the power to make a human being respond. October arrived in a violent rush of color and cold. The aspens turned gold, and the larch fell into their needle drop season, creating carpets of rust-colored needles across the forest floor. The hiking season was ending. Fewer people ventured into the high country as the weather became unpredictable, as the trails became muddy and the nights dropped below freezing, which was fine, because I'd stopped wanting people to come. That wasn't entirely true. I did want them to come, but not to my cabin, not to Macdonald Lake. I wanted them to move through my sector, to pass through the valleys and along the main trails, to experience the beauty and majesty of the wilderness without venturing into the places where the strangeness was concentrated. I was beginning to understand the geography of the creature, if creature was even the right word. It had territories, places it preferred. The lake was one. The ravine where Sarah Valen had disappeared was another. There was a stand of whitebark pine on the northern slope that had grown twisted and wrong, the trees growing in patterns that suggested they'd been responding to something. There was a meadow near the eastern boundary where no animals would graze, even in summer when forage was normally abundant. And there was the ridge. I first climbed to the ridge face in early October, following a gut instinct that probably wasn't a gut instinct at all, but rather something being communicated to me through means I didn't understand. The climb was technical and risky. I used ropes and climbing anchors, moving carefully along the rock until I reached a small overhanging shelf about halfway up the cliff. What I found there was a sort of nest, not built exactly, more like something had worn away at the rock face until a hollow had formed, and then they had refined it. The floor was lined with things. I moved closer, my headlamp cutting through the shadow. Clothing, pieces of it, shredded, aged, scattered across the stone floor like leaves. I could identify fragments of a hiking shirt in one corner, the remnants of a down jacket in another. At least a dozen distinct garments, none intact, all showing the kind of wear that suggested they'd been worked on, examined, learned from. But what made me vomit onto the rock was the journal I found. It had belonged to David Rourke, a hiker who'd gone missing in my sector in 1997, 6 years before I arrived. The journal was still mostly intact, though the pages had been leafed through thousands of times, worn thin from handling. I opened it to a random entry and immediately wished I hadn't. It came again tonight. I think it's learning to use my voice. First it just screamed, but now it's asking questions in my own words. It's asking me about climbing, about how I grip the rock. My hands are so cold, I wrapped them in the sleeping bag, but that doesn't help. It comes closer every night. It sits outside the tent. I don't know what it is. I've stopped trying to understand. I just know it's the only thing here, the only voice. All the animal sounds are gone. It's just the two of us now, and soon there will be one. The final entry was dated 3 weeks later. I'm going to try tomorrow. The overhang on the east face. If I can reach it, maybe there's a way down the backside. I'm so tired. It talks all night. Sometimes in my voice, sometimes in my father's voice, asking to come in, asking for water, asking about the taste of blood, which it's never had, which it wants to know, asking why I don't answer anymore. The journal ended, that was all. I found David Rourke's body 60 feet below the shelf, wedged into a crack in the rock face. I only found it because I was looking, because I understood what the final entry meant. The remains were old, the skeleton mostly intact, the clothing long ago rotted to fibers. But there were marks on the bones that were newer, gouges and wear patterns that suggested something had been working at them periodically, learning their structure, understanding what lay beneath the skin. I descended the cliff in a state that I can only describe as absolute clarity. I understood what I was dealing with. I understood what it wanted. And I understood that it had been waiting for me for years. That my arrival at the cabin, the position opening up at precisely the time I needed to disappear, might not have been coincidence at all. That night I sat at the kitchen table and made a decision. I couldn't leave. If I left, it would follow, or it would hunt someone else who ventured into my territory. I couldn't report it without sounding insane. The evidence, scattered clothing, a single journal, strange behavior from animals would be dismissed as coincidence and my own mental deterioration blamed on isolation. What I could do was learn. What I could do was understand the patterns, the communication, the rules it operated under. So I started having conversations with it. I left notes outside the cabin. Not in words it could read, but in the only language it seemed to be developing. Images and patterns. I carved symbols into trees, placed stones in specific arrangements, created markers that I suspected might communicate with something that experienced the world in a different sensory mode than sight and sound alone. The creature responded. It came closer. It began leaving messages of its own. A dead animal positioned in a specific way, stones arranged in a line, and most chillingly, recordings. I found it had apparently stolen a handheld recording device from one of the missing hikers, and it had filled the device with voice samples. Hours and hours of people speaking, often the same phrases repeated hundreds of times, as if it was drilling itself on pronunciation, syntax, inflection. But the content of what it was learning to say, I am so hungry it hurts. Teach me what love means. Will you stay with me? Why do you smell like rain and copper? I can be anyone you want. I'm so sorry for what I am. I'm learning to be human. I'm learning to be alive. I'm learning to be you. November descended with early snow. The high passes closed. The park's elevation meant that late-season hiking became increasingly dangerous, and my sector was entered by fewer than 10 people that month. I continued my patrols, my documentation, my learning. The creature was becoming clearer to me, not in appearance. I never saw it in any traditional sense, but in intention. It was, without question, intelligent, possibly more intelligent than I was. It was also profoundly lonely. Every message, every communication, every attempt at mimicry seemed to stem from a deep need for connection, for understanding, for someone to recognize it without fear. It was also absolutely, inescapably dangerous. I think about Sarah Valen sometimes, about what her final moments were like. The creature probably tried to communicate, probably called to her in her own voice, in voices she trusted, probably wanted her to stay, to teach it, to be its first real conversation. When she ran, when she refused, when she tried to escape, the confusion and hurt might have manifested in ways that weren't kind. By mid-November, the isolation at the cabin was complete. Snow was falling regularly, temperatures at night dropping to 20 below zero. I was supplied with enough food and fuel to last through March, when the next ranger would rotate in for the winter season, except that no one was rotating in. When I checked my email using the satellite connection, I found a message from Cordell informing me that the budget for year-round staffing had been cut. I would remain at the cabin through the winter, but routine ranger visits would cease. I was being given full autonomy and responsibility for the sector. In other words, I was being left completely alone. I found this funny, though my laughter had a sharp, unstable edge to it. That night, I did something I'd been avoiding. I went to the lake with the intention of direct communication. The water was half frozen, a thin crust of ice forming at the edges. I stood at the shore and called out, my voice raw from disuse in normal conversation. I know you're here. I know what you are. I want to make a deal. The wind moved across the water, and the ice made creaking sounds, as if the lake was breathing. When the voice came, it was in a language made almost entirely of sounds it had harvested from the missing hikers. Fragments of conversation, words pulled apart and reassembled, organized in a syntax that was partially human and partially something else entirely. You understand. Others run. You stay. Why? The question was so direct, so fundamentally earnest, that for a moment I couldn't formulate a response. Why had I stayed? Partly from fear, partly from a sense of responsibility to protect other hikers from a similar fate. But there was something else too, a recognition perhaps, of another being that didn't quite fit into the world it inhabited. Because I understand what it's like to not belong, I said. The creature was silent for a long time. Long enough that I thought I might have been wrong about its ability to understand spoken language. Then it responded, its voice now approximating human inflection more closely, mixing words from the recordings with new sounds. I was here before the mountains learned their names, before humans came. I lived in the dark places, the spaces between stone and stone. I was never lonely then. There was only the hunger and the learning. But then you came, all of you, and I learned what loneliness was. I learned what it meant to want something you cannot have. I sat down on the frozen shore, my joints cracking with the cold. What are you? I asked. I don't know. Your language doesn't have a name for what I am. I'm something in the process of becoming. Something that learned how to use sound by eating sound. Something that learned how to think by thinking about thinking. I'm alone, and you're alone, and I thought maybe. It trailed off. The silence was almost as terrible as the voice had been. What will happen when winter is over? I asked. I don't know. I don't plan that far. I only know that spring brings more hikers, and I'm not ready to let them go. And I'm not sure I can keep doing this. The learning, the calling, the wanting. I'm not sure my mind was made for sustained loneliness. The moon rose over the ridge, and everything turned a shade of pale blue that seemed to empty the world of meaning. I'll help you, I heard myself say. I'll stay through the winter. I'll teach you. But in the spring, if anyone else dies, I'll have to do something about it. Would you kill me? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not offense. No, I said. But I'd have to leave, and I'd have to tell people, and they would come with guns and helicopters and dogs, and they would kill you. The creature contemplated this. Then I will not kill anyone in the spring. I will go deeper. I will go to the places where humans never venture, and I will try not to be lonely. Is that acceptable? Yes, I said. That's acceptable. What followed was the strangest winter of my life. I taught the creature, though the name feels insufficient for what it was, about the world through books. I brought them outside and read them aloud, leaving them for it to examine. I sang to it, taught it songs, played it recorded music. I became a sort of guardian, a professor of human experience for something that would never truly be human but desperately wanted to understand what humanity meant. In exchange, it left me alone. More than that, it protected me. On 3 occasions that winter, avalanche conditions developed that could have swept the cabin away. The snow that should have slid instead held. Once, I started a fire in the stove that flared in a way that should have been dangerous. It was extinguished by what seemed like impossibly rapid snowfall, collected on the roof and falling down the chimney. These might have been coincidences. I no longer believed in coincidence. The creature's understanding deepened through the winter. Its communications became more sophisticated, more nuanced. It asked complex questions about love, about morality, about the nature of hunger and satisfaction. It asked about why humans feared death when it was simply a transition, a transformation. It asked what made a life worth living. I tried to answer as best I could, knowing that my answers were inadequate, knowing that I was trying to explain human experience to something that had fundamentally different neurology, different ways of processing the world. By late February, the creature had stopped calling to dead hikers. It had stopped mimicking voices with the intention to deceive. It had adopted something approaching a philosophical outlook on its own nature. I will leave, it told me one night. In the spring, I will go to the deepest parts of the range, to the places humans have no names for. I will find others like me if they exist. I will stop being lonely by being part of something larger than loneliness. But I wanted to thank you, Macdonald. You were the first one who didn't run. The first one who tried to understand. I sat with that for a long moment. Will I ever see you again? I asked. Would you want to? The question hung in the cold air. Yes, I said finally. I think I would. Spring arrived like it had never left. Sudden and violent and green. The snow melted in a matter of weeks. The valleys filled with the sound of running water. Bears emerged from their dens and the birds returned, and the entire ecosystem seemed to shake itself awake and resume the business of living. My sector was soon populated again. Hikers began arriving in late April, moving through the trails with their maps and their GPS devices and their false sense of security. I processed permit applications, conducted safety briefings, responded to the minor emergencies that humans create through hubris and poor planning. None of them disappeared. None of them heard voices in the night. I ran into Cordell in early May. He'd come out for the spring inventory, to check on the cabin and the equipment, to ensure that I'd survive the winter without falling into madness or despair. You look different, he said, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read the signs of isolation. Lighter, maybe. Less burdened. I'm fine, I said, and meant it. The winter was quiet. I did a lot of reading, a lot of thinking. Any unusual activity, anything to report? I considered what that question meant. The deaths from previous years, the artifacts still hidden at the ridge shelter, the journals and the clothing and the evidence of the creature's long residence in my sector, the communications I'd maintained through the winter, the strange sort of friendship that had formed between myself and something that existed on the margins of nature. No, I said. Everything was normal, quiet, but normal. Cordell seemed satisfied with that answer. We went through the cabin inventory, checked the equipment, ensured that the stove wasn't damaged and the roof had held against the snow. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. You know you're welcome to request a transfer anytime. 3 years is a long tenure for this posting. Most rangers want more human contact than you get here. I looked out the window at Macdonald Lake, the water still gray and cold with spring runoff, the surrounding peaks still mostly white with snow. No, I said. I think I'll stay a while longer. I'm not finished here. After Cordell left, I took my usual evening walk around the lake. The trails were beginning to show signs of seasonal use, disturbed vegetation, boot prints in the soft ground, the small scarrings that come from human presence in wild places. I found a message at the clearing where I'd had my winter conversations. It was written in stones, arranged on the ground in a deliberate pattern. Not words exactly, but a set of images and symbols that took me several minutes to decode. A mountain, a star, a creature moving downward, deeper, away. And then, at the end, a single mark that approximated the shape of a human hand. The creature had kept its promise. It had gone to the deep places, the spaces where humans rarely ventured. And it had done so with what I could only interpret as gratitude. I will never fully understand what I helped to do that winter. Whether I saved the creature from its own nature, whether I accelerated its evolution, whether I was complicit in creating something that might eventually be dangerous in ways I couldn't foresee, these are the questions that wake me up some nights. Even now, a year and a half later, as I sit in this cabin and watch the seasons cycle through their changes, what I know for certain is that the creature was real. It existed. It was lonely in a way that transcended simple isolation, in a way that spoke to some fundamental mismatch between its neurology and the world it inhabited. And in teaching it, in attempting to bridge the gap between human and other, I became something different myself. I accepted this job because I needed to disappear. What I didn't realize was that disappearing isn't about removing yourself from the world. It's about finding a place where you can be who you truly are without having to explain yourself to anyone. At Glacier National Park in my remote sector overlooking Macdonald Lake, I found that place, and I made a friend in the darkness. Not a human friend, not something that resembles humanity in any traditional sense, but a companion in the knowledge that loneliness is a language we all speak, no matter what form our mouths take. The mountains keep their secrets. I keep mine. And somewhere in the high alpine country, in the spaces between stone and stone, something that was learning to be is learning still. The seasons turn, the hikers come and go. The creature watches from a distance, no longer hungry in the way it once was, no longer calling out in voices stolen from the dead. And I remain, the lonely park ranger with the old name and the new life, standing guard over a wilderness that is far stranger than any map suggests, far older than any park administration document acknowledges, and infinitely more wondrous than the people who passed through it could ever imagine. This is what happened at Glacier. This is what I kept. This is my truth, and I have earned the right to live with it. I took the position at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. That sounds theatrical, I know, but it's the honest answer. After 15 years managing corporate security systems in Seattle, watching screens and writing reports about data breaches that meant nothing to me, I couldn't stomach another Monday morning. My marriage had ended 2 years prior, and I'd done the expected thing. Saw a therapist, joined a running club, attended networking events. None of it took. My name is Costas. My mother was from northern Greece, my father from the Blackfeet Reservation near Missoula. Growing up between two worlds meant belonging fully to neither, which sounds worse than it was. What mattered was that I'd spent summers as a boy camping with my paternal grandfather in the mountains around Glacier, and those were the only stretches of time I felt genuinely present in my own life. He passed when I was 16. I didn't return to those mountains for 25 years. When I saw the job posting for a seasonal backcountry ranger at Glacier, something shifted in my chest. The posting was straightforward. Maintain trails, monitor wildlife activity, assist lost hikers, manage 3 remote stations during the summer season. The pay was modest, but that didn't matter. What mattered was solitude in the place where I'd last felt real. The interview was conducted via video call by a woman named Sandra who ran the ranger program. She didn't ask much. A background check cleared me despite my 15-year absence from outdoor work. They were understaffed that season. She seemed relieved I was willing to work the northern sector, the area around Kinta Lake, a stretch of backcountry that most younger rangers found too isolated. On my first day in late May, I drove my truck to the ranger station at the park's edge. The mountains rose like a memory I'd been carrying without knowing it. Peaks of red stone and pale granite caught the afternoon light. The air was different here, thinner and sharper, carrying the smell of pine sap and wet earth. Sandra met me at the station. She was in her 50s, weathered in the way mountain people become weathered. "You've done this before," she said, not quite a question. "As a kid, not professionally." She nodded, studying me with the directness of someone who spent most of her time looking at trees. "Remote work tests people differently. You'll be alone for stretches. 6, sometimes 7 days between check-ins with the main office. The radio works most of the time. We have a satellite phone at the Kinta cabin for emergencies." "I understand. I need to tell you about the reports we've had from the northern sector." She pulled out a folder, the paper inside worn from handling. 4 separate hikers over the past 3 years have reported unusual activity near Kinta Lake. Nothing we could classify as animal behavior. One group heard what they described as a human voice calling to them from the forest. Another hiker found a trail of deep footprints in muddy ground near the lake shore. Prints too large to be human, but the shape wasn't consistent with any documented animal. I felt something cold move through my stomach. "What did you conclude?" "We never concluded anything. The last report was 2 summers ago. Nothing since. Bears are moving through the area, which causes excitement. People see what they expect to see in wild places." She closed the folder. "But I'm telling you this because you'll be alone out there. If something feels wrong, you report it immediately. We have a system." "What's the system?" "You call, then you leave. We don't investigate, we extract you." The Kinta station was a cabin built in the 1980s, 15 miles from any vehicle access. I hiked in on my second day, carrying supplies on my back, following a trail that hadn't changed much since my childhood. The lake appeared suddenly as I came down a ridge, and the sight of it stopped me completely. The water was the color of iron, still and perfect. Mountains enclosed it on 3 sides, their slopes dense with spruce and whitebark pine. The cabin sat on a point of granite overlooking the shore, and I could see why my grandfather had loved this place. There was a quietness here that felt intentional, as though the land had decided long ago that this particular corner would be kept sacred. The cabin was small but well maintained. A metal roof, a wooden porch, solar panels mounted on the southern wall. Inside, a bed frame with a good mattress, a table, chairs, a wood stove, and a narrow kitchen area with a propane range. Shelves held emergency supplies, first aid equipment, and several field guides. A logbook sat on the table, bound in green canvas, filled with entries from previous rangers dating back to 1996. I read through the entries as I organized my supplies. Most were mundane: weather observations, trail maintenance notes, wildlife sightings. Entries from the past 10 years became increasingly terse. A notation from August 2022 caught my eye. Heard vocalizations near North Shore around 2300. Not elk, not wolf. Did not investigate. Another from July 2021. Hikers from Seattle reported loud calls from forest at dusk. Sounded human but wrong. Said it came from multiple directions simultaneously. Advised them to leave next morning. I made my own first entry that evening. May 28. Arrived station 1600 hours. Supplies logged. Equipment functional. Beautiful conditions. Ready to begin duties. That first week passed quietly. I established a routine. Morning checks of the Northern Trail, afternoon work on maintenance, evenings reading by lantern or recording observations. The nights were long and deeply dark, a darkness that made the stars seem closer than they should be. I heard owls and the occasional distant call of a loon from the lake, sounds that felt normal and right. On my 8th day at the station, I encountered my first hikers of the season. A couple from Missoula in their 60s, well-equipped and cheerful. They'd been hiking since dawn and planned to camp at the lake before heading back. We talked about water quality and safe fire practices. As they were leaving, the man paused. "You hear anything strange out here at night?" he asked. "Strange how? We've read about the legends, the old Blackfeet stories about these mountains, about things that come down from the high country in summer." He laughed, but it wasn't quite a comfortable sound. "Anyway, you'll let us know if anything seems off, right?" I told him rangers monitored the area and everything was safe. It was the expected response. But after they left, I found myself thinking about his question and about the word he'd used, legends. My grandfather had mentioned something once, when I was a boy. We were sitting beside a fire, and he'd told me that the old stories weren't metaphors, they were descriptions. The Blackfeet people had lived in these mountains for thousands of years, and they'd developed a sophisticated understanding of which places were dangerous and why. Some dangers were physical, avalanche zones, river crossings, unpredictable weather. Others were different. He'd used a word in the Blackfeet language that I never quite learned to pronounce, something that translated roughly as, the hungry presence. He'd told me there were places where something waited, something patient and old. And the best defense was to never be alone in those places at night. Never be weak, never show fear. He'd made me promise never to camp near Kinta Lake after dark. I'd kept that promise for years, until I stopped coming to the mountains altogether. Now I was living beside it. By mid-June, I'd fallen into the rhythms of the place. I woke at dawn with the light, worked through the day and settled into the cabin before dark. I was sleeping better than I had in years, a deep and genuine sleep that felt like healing. The nightmares that had plagued me in the city, vague anxieties about failure and time wasting away, didn't follow me here. The first strange occurrence wasn't frightening, it was almost mundane. I was checking the Western Trail for deadfall when I heard what sounded like someone calling from the direction of the lake. Not words exactly, but a voice, carried on the wind. I stopped and listened, but the sound had already faded. That evening, I reviewed the logbook more carefully. 3 entries stood out, each from different rangers across different years. June 14, 1998. Heard human voice calling hello repeatedly from forest near West Shore around 2030. Checked area with flashlight, found nothing. Possibly hiker lost, but no reports from headquarters. June 24, 2007. Vocalization at dusk. Sounded like someone saying, help or possibly please. Direction appeared to shift. Reported to Sandra. She said to ignore and log it. June 9, 2019. Sound like person singing. Not English lyrics. Faded when I tried to approach. I made a note. June 15. Heard what may have been a human voice near lake. Direction unclear. Wind velocity could account for acoustic distortion. No hikers reported missing. But I didn't believe that last part, even as I wrote it. The voice hadn't sounded like wind distortion. It had sounded intentional. It had sounded like someone was trying to get my attention. The next occurrence happened 4 days later. I'd been monitoring a storm system and was checking the cabin's roof for any damage when I noticed something in the logbook that I'd somehow missed. A full-page entry written in careful, precise handwriting, dated July 3, 2015. I cannot continue at this station. The vocalizations are intensifying. 2 nights ago I heard what sounded like a woman's voice calling my name. My name. Not a generic call, but my actual name, Marcus. How would anyone know my name? I'm alone here. The next night the voice was clearer, closer, and it was no longer alone. I heard multiple voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, all seeming to say similar things. I cannot discern the words. They seem almost like human speech but inverted somehow, as though they're being spoken from inside out. I'm requesting immediate extraction. I know I'm supposed to complete the season, but I don't think I can manage another night. The entry ended there, no signature, just that one desperate page. Sandra had hired me with full knowledge that something unusual was happening at this station. She'd sent me anyway. The thought should have worried me, but instead I felt a strange kinship with whoever Marcus was. He'd documented something real. He'd described it clearly, without melodrama. If it was delusion, it was a very specific kind. I spent that night listening. The cabin was quiet. The wind moved through the trees without forming any shapes of sound. At midnight, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and watched the lake. Its surface reflected starlight with perfect clarity. Nothing moved on the water. Nothing called from the forest. Around 2:30 a.m., as I was about to return inside, I heard something far away. Not a voice this time, but a pattern of sound. It was rhythmic, something like breathing, but enormous and slow. It came from the north, from the direction of the high passes. I felt my heart rate increase, not from fear exactly, but from something like recognition. I'd heard my grandfather describe this sound once. He'd called it the sound the mountains made when something very large was moving through them. The sound faded. When it did, I felt absurdly tired. I went inside and slept until dawn. The encounters became more frequent as June progressed. Twice more I heard voices, and they did seem to know my name. The third time, unmistakably, I heard Costas called out from somewhere near the western shore. My immediate response was to grab a flashlight and check the area. I found nothing. No one. Just forest and stone and the patterns of moonlight through trees. I called the main office and reported it to Sandra. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. "I'm going to ask you something and I need an honest answer," she said finally. "Are you willing to continue? Or do you want extraction?" "I'm willing to continue." "You're not hearing one voice becoming clearer. You're hearing multiple voices, overlapping, each trying to mimic aspects of what you expect to hear. This is the pattern that intensifies if you respond to it. So you don't respond, you don't investigate, you don't engage with it in any way. This is the most important rule. The moment you stop reacting to it, stop trying to understand it, it often stops." "What is it, Sandra?" "I don't have that answer. Neither did the 3 rangers before Marcus or the ones since. All I know is that it's localized to this area. It seems to respond to human presence, and the pattern matches what's documented in the oral histories of the Blackfeet tribes who have records going back centuries, which is something that imitates, something that calls people away from their safety using voices that manipulate them emotionally. My advice is simple. Document everything, don't engage, and maintain your routine. The ones who made it through their season intact were the ones who didn't try to solve the problem." After that conversation, I changed my approach. When I heard the voices, I acknowledged them in my logbook, recorded the time and location, and then deliberately focused my attention elsewhere. I read books. I maintained equipment. I walked the trails in daylight. I didn't let myself dwell on the sounds or their meaning. Strangely, this worked. The frequency of the voices decreased. By late June, they were occurring only occasionally, and they seemed more distant. I began to think I'd adapted, that I'd found the psychological adjustment needed to cope with isolation and the power of suggestion. I even felt a kind of pride in my ability to compartmentalize what was happening. I'd found stability in wildness. I should have known better. The Kinta Lake area experienced something unusual in early July. The weather shifted dramatically. An extended cold front moved in from the north, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees and bringing afternoon snow despite it being summer. For 3 days the cabin was sealed in by weather, and I occupied myself with reading, maintenance, and careful observation of the storm. On the 4th day the weather cleared suddenly, leaving a landscape transformed. The high peaks were covered in fresh snow. The air was crystalline, so clear it almost hurt to look at the distant mountains. The lake was glass smooth and appeared colder somehow. Its color shifted toward deep blue rather than the iron gray of warm months. That afternoon, I decided to hike the eastern trail, which ascended toward a pass I hadn't visited. The hike should have taken me 6 hours round trip. I packed accordingly: water, food, first aid kit, and a satellite communicator. The trail climbed steadily through dense forest. As elevation increased, the trees thinned, and I began passing above tree line into alpine meadow. The recent snow lay thin on the rocky ground. To my right, I could see the lake far below, the cabin almost invisible against the granite. Around 2 p.m., Roughly 3 hours into the hike, I came to a stretch where the trail intersected a set of prints in the snow. I stopped immediately. The prints were large, roughly 18 inches long, with a pattern that didn't match any animal I could identify. The stride was enormous, easily 4 feet between impacts. There were 5 toes, each with a claw mark. The weight distribution seemed to suggest something bipedal but heavier than any human. The prints came from the south, from the direction I'd been walking, and continued north toward the high pass. They were fresh, made within the last 12 hours, probably much more recently. I stood there for a long time looking at them. Every reasonable explanation I tried to apply didn't fit. A bear doesn't walk on 2 legs with that stride. No known animal leaves tracks like this. The logical conclusion was that something was wrong with my perception, that I was seeing patterns that weren't there, reading meaning into random impressions in the snow. But I'd seen a lot of animal tracks in my life. Tracking requires learning to see beyond pattern recognition, to understand the actual evidence of movement. These tracks were deliberate, they were recent, and they'd been made by something very large. I didn't continue on the trail. Instead, I made a careful note of the location, took several photographs with my phone, and began the descent back toward the cabin. The day was still bright, and I moved quickly. I didn't feel followed, exactly, but I felt observed. The sensation of being watched was so pronounced that I kept checking over my shoulder, even though I saw nothing but landscape and sky. I made it back to the cabin as light was fading, my heart was racing, and my legs felt weak. I sat on the porch for a long time trying to calm myself, trying to think rationally about what I'd seen. The tracks were real, I'd photographed them. But real tracks didn't necessarily mean a real animal. People sometimes hoax evidence. Someone could have manufactured those prints to frighten rangers, particularly rangers stationed alone in remote areas with a reputation for strange occurrences. That theory felt thin, though. The location was difficult to access. Manufacturing such an elaborate deception would require knowledge of animal tracking, equipment to create marks of precise depth and angle, and a bizarre motivation to fool a single ranger who'd already decided not to investigate mysterious phenomena. As darkness fell, I called Sandra and reported the tracks. She asked questions about their appearance, their location, and their freshness. I answered each precisely, reading from my notes. "And you didn't follow them," she said. "No? Good. I'll file a report with wildlife management. They may or may not send someone to investigate. In the meantime, you continue your routine." "Sandra, what if it's not a hoax? What if something is actually living at higher elevations around here?" "Then it's an animal, Costas. It may be an animal science hasn't documented in this region for a very long time. The grizzly bears were extirpated from Glacier decades ago, but isolated populations do move through this area occasionally. Wolves are back. Cougars are everywhere now. What you saw was likely evidence of something normal that just looked unusual in the context of recent snow and altitude." The prints showed evidence of intelligence. The stride pattern suggests bipedal locomotion. Many large animals exhibit those characteristics in their tracks. Once you're back in the main office, we can look at your photographs, and wildlife experts can make an informed assessment. For now, continue your duties. I agreed and ended the call. The darkness outside was complete. The cabin's electric lights seemed inadequate against it, pushing only a small space of visibility against the pressing black. That night, I heard the voices again, but they were different this time. Not calling my name, not imitating, just making sounds. Low tones, vocalizations that lasted for minutes, coming from the direction of the lake shore. They didn't sound like a coherent language, but they sounded like communication. They sounded like something was talking to something else out in the darkness. I stayed inside. I read, and I listened to the sounds, and I told myself that Sandra was right. These were explainable phenomena. Isolation amplified the mind's capacity to interpret random stimuli as meaningful. The vocalizations were probably elk, or birds, or some combination of sounds that the brain was organizing into a pattern that resembled speech. But my grandfather had told me something else, years ago, something I'd mostly forgotten. He'd said that the most dangerous thing about these places wasn't ignorance of the danger. It was the moment when you started convincing yourself that the danger didn't exist. He'd called it the point of surrender. Once you'd convinced yourself that what was happening wasn't really happening, you were no longer protected by awareness or caution. I was at that point. By mid-July, my lease on skepticism was failing. The evidence kept accumulating, each incident more difficult to rationalize than the last. I found a section of forest 20 yards from the cabin that had been violently disturbed. Trees were broken at their trunks, snapped cleanly about 8 feet up, as though something had moved through them with tremendous force. The bark on several trees was stripped in sections, showing pale wood beneath. The stripping was too high to be attributed to browsing animals. That same week, I discovered a dead elk near the lake shore. The animal had been there less than a day, was still partially warm. Its death didn't fit any predation pattern I recognized. There were no bite marks, no claw wounds. Instead, the body was twisted, broken in places that seemed anatomically impossible. Several of its ribs had pierced through the hide from inside. Its internal organs, from what I could see without conducting a full necropsy, appeared to have been ruptured by something applied from outside, with pressure that exceeded what any conventional predator could deliver. I documented everything and reported each discovery to Sandra. Her responses became shorter, more clinical. She no longer offered explanations. She simply acknowledged the reports and told me to continue. The vocalizations intensified. By the third week of July, they occurred almost every night. The quality of the sounds changed over time. In the first week, they'd been rough and indistinct. By the third week, they'd become increasingly refined. I heard what sounded like words from multiple languages, phonetic patterns that suggested human speech, even though the overall structure remained alien. One night, about an hour after sunset, I heard my name again, but this time it came in multiple voices simultaneously, creating a kind of overlapping chorus that said Costas in what sounded like perfect unison. The effect was devastating. My entire body locked with a fear response that transcended the rational. Something was coordinating. Something was learning how to imitate human communication with increasing fidelity. I called Sandra on the satellite phone. It took several minutes to connect, but when her voice came through, it was steady. "You need to come out," I said. "There's something here and it's not remaining consistent with any animal behavior. What are you experiencing?" I told her. Everything. The tracks, the forest damage, the dead elk, the sounds, the progressive sophistication of the vocalizations. She was quiet for a very long time. "I'm calling for extraction," she said finally. "You'll hike out tomorrow morning. The main office will send a vehicle to pick you up at the trailhead. You're done for the season." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by shame. I'd quit. I'd let the strangeness drive me away exactly like Marcus had done. But the relief was stronger than the shame. That last night, I packed methodically. I left the cabin prepared for the next ranger. A full logbook with all my entries documented, the cabin cleaned, supplies inventoried. I set my alarm for dawn and lay in bed listening to the lake. The sounds started around 2 a.m. They came from the water. The vocalizations I'd heard from the forest were nothing like what emerged from the lake. These were deeper, resonant, carrying a vibration that I could feel in my chest. They formed patterns, waves of sound that built and subsided. There was an intelligence to them, a deliberate structure that suggested meaning. I got up and stood in the doorway. The night was moonlit and clear. The lake surface was still, undisturbed. But the sounds continued, coming from beneath the water, from depth. As I watched, something broke the surface about 50 yards from shore. I didn't see the creature itself, only a displacement in the water. A disturbance that was larger than any fish, large enough to create a visible swell. The vocalizations intensified. I went back inside and sat on the bed. The sounds continued until about 4 a.m. and then gradually faded. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark cabin and waited for the light. The hike out began at dawn. I'd covered about 4 miles of the 15-mile descent when I became aware of movement paralleling my route through the trees. It stayed just inside the forest boundary, moving with my pace, never emerging into open space. I didn't stop or look directly at it. I simply maintained my speed and my direction. The movement continued for perhaps 3 miles, then gradually fell away. When I reached the trailhead around early afternoon, the forest behind me was silent. A ranger named Garrett picked me up at the trailhead. He was in his late 20s, friendly, and blissfully incurious about why I was leaving 2 months before the end of the season. He drove me back to the main office, and I completed the exit procedures without elaboration. 3 weeks later, I'm back in Seattle. I'm in a coffee shop near Pike Place Market, sitting across from Sandra, who drove down for this meeting. "You had a psychological break," she said. She wasn't being unkind, just factual. The isolation, the stress, the power of suggestion, it happens. The tracks were real. The dead elk was real. The vocalizations on the recording were real. I pulled out my phone and played the audio I'd captured the final night. The sounds came through the speaker, that deep, resonant sequence of tones. the patterns that suggested both animal and intelligence. Sandra listened without expression. "I know they were real," she said. "What I mean is that you can have documented real events and still experience a psychological response that distorts your interpretation of them. An elk can die of disease or parasites. A large animal moving through the forest can sound startling when you're alone. Tracks in snow are subject to interpretation. What about the water sounds? What about the thing that surfaced in the lake?" "I don't know," Sandra said. It was the first time she'd admitted that. "There are a lot of things we don't know about deep lakes in remote areas. But I will tell you something that I haven't told you before. I've worked with the Blackfeet Nation to research the historical records of this area. There's documented oral history describing something that lives in Kinta Lake. The description is fragmentary because the people who described it generally tried to avoid discussing it, but the consensus is that it's something large, aquatic, intelligent, and it calls to people. It's been documented in accounts spanning at least 200 years. So you knew what I'd encounter." "I suspected. I couldn't be certain. I sent you there with full knowledge that something unusual was happening, yes. I did this because we need information. We need someone to document what happens in that place without immediately evacuating. You provided us with credible evidence of activity that no one has documented in such detail before." I felt a cold anger move through me. "You used me. I protected you," she said. "The moment you reported something outside your psychological tolerance, I arranged extraction. That's the system. We push the boundary of investigation incrementally, but we have a safety threshold. You reached yours, which is completely normal. Most people would reach it much faster." I have no response to this. The coffee shop noise seems very loud around us, very removed from the reality of what we're discussing. "What happens now?" I ask. "What happens to the next ranger you station there?" "We'll continue the rotation. We'll continue documentation. These creatures, whatever they are, have been present in these mountains far longer than we have. We're not going to stop them. We're not going to kill them. We're simply trying to understand the parameters of their existence and behavior. Your information contributes to that understanding." I thought of my grandfather, who had spent his entire life respecting the boundary between human and wild, never crossing it, never trying to understand it on human terms. "They're learning from us," I said. "The voices, the vocalizations, they were becoming more sophisticated. They were starting to mimic human speech accurately. That suggests rapid adaptation, rapid intelligence." Sandra nodded. "That's the conclusion we've reached as well. The question is whether that intelligence is increasing, decreasing, or stable, whether it's directional or cyclical. The only way to answer those questions is through continued observation." I left the coffee shop without making a decision about the next season. I've had 3 weeks to think about it. I've listened to my recordings repeatedly. I've looked at my photographs of the tracks. I've read accounts from historical documents of the Blackfeet experiences with the thing that calls from the deep places. I still feel the weight of it on me. I still hear those overlapping voices, that moment when something named my name in absolute unison. I still feel the terror of watching something displace the water of the lake from beneath. And I think I'll go back, not for Sandra, not for scientific documentation, not for any noble reason. I'll go back because I need to understand what's happening in that place, and because understanding requires courage, and because the alternative is to live in a city that feels less real to me every day, as though I've become something that requires a different kind of air to breathe. The lake is waiting. The voices are waiting. And somewhere in that darkness and depth, something is learning to speak in a way that we might finally be able to listen to. I just hope it's the thing that teaches us, and not the other way around. When the email came through in March, I had been unemployed for 6 months. Not the kind of unemployment where you float between retail jobs and coffee shops, but the serious kind, where you've burned through savings and your apartment lease is coming due in 30 days. The position appeared in my inbox under the subject line, Seasonal Ranger Position, Glacier National Park, Remote Station Assignment. Remote Station Assignment. Those were the magic words that made me click through despite the low pay. The National Park Service wasn't looking for my enthusiasm or my credentials, which were admittedly thin. They needed someone willing to staff Macdonald Lake Outpost, a cabin-based monitoring station 7 miles into the backcountry from the nearest trailhead. The pay was just enough to keep me solvent for the season. More importantly, it meant isolation. In my current state of mind, isolation sounded like salvation. The cabin itself was the draw. Park Service postings usually included photographs. This one showed a structure built sometime in the 1970s, basic but solid, situated on the northeastern shore of Macdonald Lake. The lake stretched perhaps 2 miles across, hemmed in by dense conifer forest and granite peaks that scraped the summer sky. No cell service, no internet unless I wanted to sit in the ranger station office 2 miles south at the main trail junction. No neighbors except the wildlife, the trees, and the sound of wind moving through the high country. The station supervisor conducting my phone interview was named Jessica Grant. She was efficient, professional, and seemed surprised by my qualifications. I suspect I got the position because no one else had applied. She explained my duties with the tone of someone reciting a safety briefing. I would monitor wildlife populations using provided tracking equipment. I would maintain the cabin and the surrounding outpost. I would respond to any emergency calls routed through the ranger network, though she made it clear that emergency calls in that region were rare. She emphasized the isolation one more time, watching for hesitation. When I showed none, she seemed satisfied. "Understand," she said, "that you'll be essentially alone out there for 8 months. The cabin has a wood-burning stove, an old generator, and a satellite phone for emergencies. During winter, we don't expect you to do much beyond basic survival and maintenance. In summer and fall, we need the wildlife counts and lake monitoring data." I assured her I understood. I didn't tell her that the prospect of months alone in a cabin 7 miles from human contact felt like the only thing keeping me from making decisions I couldn't take back. I arrived at Glacier on May 15th, driving through landscape that seemed designed to humble anyone who thought they understood the scale of the world. The peaks appeared first as distant teeth on the horizon, then grew steadily larger until they dominated everything. Rock, snow, and altitude arranged in geometric violence against the sky. I picked up supplies in the town of West Glacier, loaded my truck with flour, canned goods, batteries, and fuel, then drove the service road to the Dakota trailhead. The hike-in was harder than I expected. The trail climbed steadily, and at this elevation the air itself felt thin and hostile. Dust coated my lungs. Every step pressed my boots into rocky terrain that promised to twist an ankle without warning. I carried everything in a large pack and a day bag. The weight distributed across my shoulders in a way that made me understand, viscerally, that I was moving away from rescue, away from help, away from anything resembling human infrastructure. The lake appeared suddenly as I cleared a ridge. It was larger than the photographs suggested, and the water held the particular shade of blue that comes from glacier melt. The cabin sat on the shore exactly where the pictures showed it, a structure of weathered wood and a stone chimney, smoke stained from years of stove fires. Behind it rose a slope of mature pine, and across the water, the far shore climbed toward alpine meadow and then to rock. I was alone in a way that has no parallel in modern life. I was 7 miles from the nearest human. The next nearest human was probably 20 miles away. Beyond that, towns and cities existed in descending order of proximity, but they were all abstractions now. The only reality was the lake, the mountains, the cabin, and myself. The cabin's interior smelled of old wood and dust. The previous ranger, whoever they were, had left minimal personal effects. A bookshelf held a few water-damaged paperbacks. A logbook sat on the desk, filled with handwritten entries noting weather conditions, animal sightings, and maintenance tasks. The most recent entries were from October of the previous year, nearly 8 months old. I settled in with the kind of methodical care usually reserved for moving into a new home. I cleaned the stove and stacked wood. I tested the generator, which coughed and rumbled to life with a sound that seemed obscene in the mountain silence. I examined the satellite phone and the wildlife monitoring equipment, motion-triggered cameras, notebooks, elevation maps marked with previous sighting locations. That first night I sat on the cabin porch and watched the light drain from the mountains. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the world transformed. The greens became blacks. The sky shifted from blue to purple to something more complex and strange. Stars began to accumulate overhead, emerging from darkness in ones and twos until the entire expanse of sky held more light than the earth. The forest made sounds. I heard them distinctly. Branches shifting, something moving through undergrowth perhaps 100 yards to the north. Elk, I told myself, or deer, or one of the bears that called this region home. I wasn't afraid. The isolation had already begun its work, and I welcomed it. That night I slept 12 hours, waking to find the cabin cold and the forest still dark. I restarted the stove and made coffee, then sat at the desk with the Park Service logbook and began making my first entries. Temperature, 34 degrees. Conditions, clear. Animal sign, recent elk track near the lake's eastern shore. Cabin status, good. I was settling into a new kind of life, one where the primary challenge would be managing my own mind. I had no idea then what the mountains had already begun to arrange. The first 2 months were quiet in the way that the mountains insist upon quietness. I established routines. I monitored wildlife. I hiked the perimeter of my responsibility and recorded what I found. The motion-triggered cameras captured footage of deer, elk, and on 3 separate occasions a black bear moving through the forest with an unhurried gait that suggested complete confidence in its domain. The weather moved through predictable patterns. Summer heat during the day, dropping to near freezing at night. Rain came in the form of afternoon thunderstorms that moved across the peaks with genuine violence, lightning striking the high country while I sat in the cabin, safe and observant. I took extensive notes. This was what the Park Service had hired me for, and I approached the work with genuine care. But by late July, I began to notice something off about the animal patterns. The entries in the previous ranger's logbook mentioned specific game trails, routes that elk used seasonally, deer paths that were reliably frequented. The motion-triggered cameras I'd set along these trails should have captured regular traffic. For the first month they did. I would pull the memory cards every few days and find footage of wildlife moving through predictable patterns, exactly as documented. Then the animals began to avoid those routes. I noticed it first by the absence of footage. The camera positioned along the northern game trail, which had captured images almost every other day, went silent for a week. Then, too, I hiked out to verify the equipment was functioning. The camera worked fine. The motion sensor was sensitive. But the animals had stopped using that path. It wasn't just one trail. Over the course of 2 weeks in early August, every major game trail around the lake's perimeter showed the same pattern. The animals were rerouting. They were moving in new directions, avoiding areas they had used consistently for years. I should have thought about this more carefully. A competent biologist might have recognized what was happening. Instead, I noted it in the logbook and moved on, assuming some seasonal pattern I wasn't informed about. The Park Service hadn't mentioned anything unusual in their brief orientation. Costas had simply shown me how to use the equipment and indicated where previous sightings had been recorded. In the second week of August, I saw the first deer that was wrong. I was hiking along the lake's eastern shore, reviewing camera positions and checking for equipment issues. The weather had been clear for 3 days, and I was taking advantage of the stability. The forest here was dense, dominated by spruce and pine that blocked much of the sky even during daylight. The undergrowth was minimal at this elevation, mostly exposed rock and scattered alpine plants. The deer stepped out from behind a stand of trees perhaps 30 yards ahead. I stopped immediately. This was normal. Deer didn't typically flee on sight, though they would keep distance. This one did neither. It stood completely motionless, facing me directly. I could see it clearly, a doe, perhaps 4 years old, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of surviving in harsh terrain. But something about its posture was wrong. It stood too rigidly, like a thing that had forgotten the natural slouch of a living animal. Its ears were forward, locked on me with an intensity that felt deliberate, predatory. I had been isolated for 3 months. My instinct to rationalize was acute. It was probably the light, probably the angle I was viewing it from, probably any number of mundane explanations that would allow me to file this away as unremarkable. The deer's mouth opened. There was no sound, but the jaw dropped in a way that disconnected from the rest of the animal's posture. I could see the interior of its mouth, dark, strangely textured. The movement was deliberate and slow, nothing like the quick reflexes of a living animal. It was a movement that suggested mechanical operation, a jaw opening because something had decided it should open, not because of any natural impulse. I took a step backward. The deer closed its mouth. The movement reversed with the same mechanical precision. Then it simply turned and walked back into the forest, moving with an odd stiffness that suggested damage in its joints. I watched it disappear into the shadow of the trees, and for several minutes afterward, I stood completely still, trying to process what I had just witnessed. That night, I wrote the encounter in the logbook with clinical precision. Unusual animal behavior, possibly diseased deer exhibiting neurological symptoms, noted for monitoring. The words felt inadequate, but I didn't know how to express the quality of wrongness I had felt. The encounter hadn't involved violence or explicit threat. It had been, in some measurable way, far more disturbing than either would have been. The incident might have ended there, a curiosity recorded in the logbook, if similar incidents hadn't begun to occur with increasing frequency. Over the next 2 weeks, I encountered 3 more animals exhibiting the same qualities. A young bull elk, standing motionless at the lake's edge for nearly 10 minutes before I moved closer, forcing it to retreat. A black bear that watched me from across a ravine with an intensity of focus that seemed impossible for an apex predator. A raven that perched on the cabin's roof and tilted its head at angles that suggested the neck was operating beyond normal anatomical constraints. The pattern became clear through my steadily accumulating observations. The animals hadn't left the region. They were still present, still using the lake as a water source, still occupying the forest. But their behavior had transformed into something studied and wrong. They moved with diminished animation. They positioned themselves to observe rather than to forage. When I encountered them, they regarded me with an attention that felt alien. I began to feel observed in a way that extended beyond the simple reality of being in a wild place. This was different. This was the sensation of being studied by something that had learned to wear the shape of familiar animals. By the third week of August, I had stopped hiking the perimeter for routine monitoring. I remained close to the cabin, venturing out only when necessary for water or to check the most essential equipment. The isolation that had seemed so appealing in May had transformed into something more complex. I was still isolated, but the quality had changed. I was no longer alone. Something was present in the forest, and it was paying attention. The temperature dropped significantly in early September. Snow appeared in the high passes weeks earlier than the Park Service historical data suggested was normal. The lake's surface began to ice at the edges first, then progressively toward the center. The forest underwent its seasonal color shift in accelerated fashion, as if whatever mechanism controlled the calendar was running at increased speed. I remained in the cabin most days, maintaining the stove, managing the supply of firewood, and monitoring the satellite equipment. Costas had radioed once in late August with a routine check-in. I had assured her that everything was normal, that wildlife counts were on schedule, that the cabin was secure. None of that was technically a lie, though it was impressively incomplete. Around the 15th of September, I found the first animal that was dead. It was a mule deer, positioned on the trail approximately a quarter mile from the cabin. I only found it because I had forced myself to conduct a perimeter check, refusing to let fear completely override my professional responsibility. The body was relatively fresh, perhaps 24 hours old based on the minimal decomposition. But the manner of death was what seized my attention. The deer had been systematically dismantled. All 4 legs had been removed with precision, cut cleanly at the joints as if by something with knowledge of anatomy or simple brutal efficiency. The spine had been separated from the body, the ribs spread open like the pages of a book. The internal organs were gone. The head remained, positioned at a specific angle relative to the body. I forced myself to touch nothing. I forced myself to simply observe and remember details. The cuts were clean. There was a pattern to the removal and arrangement. This wasn't a kill made by a predator in a frenzy of feeding. This was a kill made by something with deliberation, something that understood how to take a body apart. I returned to the cabin and sat at the desk, trying to process the implications. Bears could do that kind of damage, but bears didn't typically remove organs and arrange remains with symbolic precision. Mountain lions rarely left entire bodies exposed. The precision suggested something else. Something that had either knowledge or instinct far more sophisticated than I wanted to contemplate. The fear I had been managing began to calcify into something more substantial. I stopped checking on the perimeter equipment. I stopped hiking anywhere but the immediate surroundings of the cabin. I increased my firewood consumption and kept the cabin temperature elevated, almost unbearably so. The warmth felt necessary in a way that seemed to extend beyond physical comfort. Costas called on the satellite phone in late September. I could hear concern in her voice. The data uploads stopped about 2 weeks ago, she said. Is the equipment malfunctioning? I assured her the equipment was fine. I explained that I had been conducting a system audit and would resume data transmission shortly. She accepted this explanation with minimal pushback, though I could sense her skepticism. The Park Service wasn't accustomed to rangers who stopped submitting their data. I restarted the equipment uploads but sent only carefully selected files, the most mundane wildlife counts, the routine maintenance logs, nothing that would raise questions. I continued to document everything in my physical logbook, but I became selective about what I transmitted digitally. By October, the forest had entered a state of profound quiet. The birds had migrated. The larger animals appeared less frequently around the cabin, though I continued to sense their presence in the forest. The raven that had perched on the cabin roof came back occasionally, always at dusk, always positioning itself to observe the cabin's interior. The first real sign that something was actively stalking the cabin came on the 4th of October. I found the tracks the morning after a particularly cold night. They were fresh, pressed into the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight. They circled the cabin completely, around the porch, around the walls, as if something had been examining the structure from every angle. They were large. I measured them against my hand, and they extended nearly half again as long as my palm. The print pattern showed a configuration unlike any mammal I could identify. 4 forward-facing impressions, something that might have been a heel, and drag marks suggesting motion that was bipedal but fundamentally wrong. I photographed the tracks with my satellite phone's camera, then reviewed the images. The print was deep, suggesting significant weight. The pattern remained consistent, the same configuration repeating again and again around the cabin's perimeter. Whatever had made them had circled my home with careful, systematic attention. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the cabin's table with a knife and the logbook, documenting everything I could remember about the months since my arrival. The changes in animal behavior, the wrongness I had observed, the deer that had opened its jaw in that mechanical fashion, the dismantled mule deer, the tracks and the frost. As I wrote, I became conscious of something pressing against the periphery of my attention. It wasn't a sound exactly, it was the absence of sound, the quality of silence that registers on the human nervous system as threat. The forest outside the cabin had gone profoundly quiet. The wind had stopped. The trees had ceased their creaking. Even the sound of the stove seemed to recede. I looked up from the logbook. The raven was on the window ledge, its head cocked at that anatomically impossible angle, its eye pressed against the glass. I stood up slowly, my hand still gripping the knife. The bird didn't move. We were separated by approximately 3 inches of glass, yet the quality of its regard was so intense that it felt like no barrier at all. Its eye was black, completely black, without the minor variations in tone that usually characterized birds' eyes. It was a darkness that seemed to extend beyond simple pigmentation. The raven opened its mouth. The sound that emerged was not a bird call. It was approximately human-shaped, a word-like construction that used my language without understanding it. It sounded like the phonetic sequence for open, if that sequence had been produced by something that had heard human speech only once and was attempting to recreate it from memory. I moved to the far side of the cabin. The raven remained at the window for several minutes more, then departed. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the following night either. By the 6th of October, exhaustion had made my thoughts distant and unreliable. But the exhaustion was preferable to sleep, because sleep invited dreams, and the dreams were becoming difficult to distinguish from waking reality. The breakdown of the cabin's isolation was gradual at first, then sudden. I began finding evidence that something had attempted to enter the structure. The doorframe showed scratches, marks where something had tested the integrity of the wood. The windows bore pressure damage, not shattering breaks, but systematic impressions that suggested patient, methodical investigation. One of the interior window frames had begun to warp as if exposed to persistent force over hours at a time. The tracks around the cabin became more numerous. I no longer photographed them, no longer maintained the pretense that I was documenting something for the Park Service. I was writing everything in the physical logbook now, pages accumulating in my handwriting that became increasingly difficult to read as exhaustion and fear collaborated to dissolve my fine motor control. On October 10th, I found the message. It was scratched into the wooden doorframe, positioned at approximately my eye level. The marks were deep, deliberately applied, using something harder than wood. The pattern was irregular but arranged in a configuration I recognized, though I struggled to accept the recognition. They formed letters, crude but unmistakable. The sequence was simple. Come out. I locked the door, as if locks could mean anything now. By this point, I had stopped maintaining pretense of normalcy with the Park Service. The data uploads had ceased entirely. Jessica had radioed twice more, expressing concern that was growing into alarm. I had responded briefly both times, assuring her that equipment maintenance was still ongoing. I don't think she believed me. The progression of events had developed a rhythm that suggested intent, the circling of the cabin, the tracks that grew larger and more confident, the sounds that began to emerge from the forest as darkness deepened each evening. They were almost animal calls, almost recognizable, but containing variations that suggested intention and mockery. On October 12th, something forced its way partially through the warped window frame. I was asleep in the cabin's back room when it happened, and I woke to the sound of splintering wood. By the time I lit the lamp and moved to investigate, the intrusion had ceased, but the window frame had been pressed inward perhaps 3 inches, and there were marks on the interior sill, indentations that suggested fingers, too many fingers. and joints that bent in directions that felt anatomically unjust. I fled to the back room and barricaded myself there, pushing furniture against the door, though I understood that furniture would be inadequate against anything determined enough to breach the cabin's wall. I sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside, which had evolved into something more openly vocalized. They were attempts at communication, I understood. Something was trying to speak, using phonetic frameworks it had learned by studying human language, but filtered through a throat and vocal apparatus designed for completely different sounds. The result was a series of acoustic aberrations that seemed to target something primal in the human nervous system. Around midnight, I forced myself to use the satellite phone. I called Jessica directly, using the emergency contact number. She answered almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for my call. "Where are you?" she asked without preamble. "The cabin," I said. "At Macdonald Lake. Something is outside. Something that... I don't know how to describe what it is, but it's trying to enter the structure." There was a long silence. Then, "Describe the sounds." I did in fragmentary detail, attempting to communicate the quality of something not quite animal, the pattern of deliberation behind the vocalizations, the sense that whatever was producing them had studied human speech and was consciously attempting to replicate it. When I finished, Jessica didn't immediately respond. I could hear her breathing, though no other sound came through the connection. "How long have you been isolated there?" she finally asked. "Since May," I said. 5 months. "And these sounds, when did they start?" "Late September. But the animal behavior was wrong before that." "Since August." Another long silence. Then she said something that transformed my understanding of the situation entirely. "You're not the first ranger we've assigned to that station," she said quietly. "We've had 12 rangers there in the past 17 years. 3 of them contacted us with similar concerns. 2 of those rangers, the rangers were airlifted out because their condition at evacuation suggested severe psychological crisis. 1 ranger we had to remove by force when he refused to leave. The 3rd contacted us with your exact concerns and was never successfully evacuated. We found the cabin empty 8 months later." My hands began shaking in a way I couldn't control. "What is it?" I asked. "What's out there?" "I don't know," Jessica said, and I could hear genuine fear in her voice. "The Park Service has been attempting to suppress the data for 15 years. We've classified the entire section of the park, the lake, the surrounding terrain, everything in a 5-mile radius. No official reports. No public information. But the pattern is consistent. Something exists there that shouldn't exist. Something that preys on whatever humans we place in that location." "Why would you place anyone there?" I asked. The question came out as a shout, and I forced myself to lower my voice, conscious of the fact that something outside might be listening. "Because," she said, "we needed to understand what we were dealing with. We needed to gather data, and because..." She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "And because we were hoping someone might actually survive long enough to give us real information instead of a psychological profile that could be dismissed as paranoia." The sounds outside had ceased. That absence was somehow more terrifying than the continued vocalizations had been. "I'm going to authorize an immediate evacuation," Jessica said. "There's a helicopter that can reach your location by dawn if weather permits. Can you hold position until then?" I looked at the barricaded door, at the evidence of systematic pressure being applied to the cabin's structure, at the thing outside that had apparently been testing human endurance against whatever biological imperative drove it. "Yes," I lied. "I can hold." The helicopter never came. The weather deteriorated during the night, and by dawn visibility had dropped to approximately 10 feet. Jessica radioed at first light to inform me that the evacuation had been postponed. She assured me that they were monitoring conditions and that they would launch the moment weather permitted. She made me promise to maintain radio contact. I maintained it, reporting hourly through the morning and early afternoon. But around 3 in the afternoon, the satellite phone went dead. Not the battery, not the connection. The phone simply powered down, and when I attempted to restart it, it displayed a screen message that indicated complete system failure. The radio equipment that I had received emergency training to operate also ceased functioning approximately 2 hours later. I was, once again, completely alone. The realization felt almost peaceful in its finality. The uncertainty of external assistance had been removed. I no longer needed to maintain the delusion that escape was possible. I could focus entirely on the present, on the problem, on the thing that was systematically preparing to enter the cabin. The pressure on the structure intensified throughout the afternoon. The already damaged window frame finally splintered completely, and something began to work at the opening. I didn't look. I sat at the cabin's table and added to the logbook, documenting what I had learned, what I suspected, and what I believed was about to occur. When darkness fell completely, the thing outside ceased its attempts at forced entry. Instead, it called. The sound was unlike anything I had processed before. It was a vocalization that reached into the frequency ranges below normal human hearing, vibrations that registered against my chest and skull rather than my ears. Underneath that frequency there was language. Not human language, not exactly, but something that used the structures of human language in ways that seemed designed to bypass interpretation and strike directly at the hindbrain. I understood the message, though not through words. It was telling me that time was ending, that the constraint period was over, that the hunger that had been accumulating through the autumn months had reached a threshold. It was telling me that I was the purpose of this place, this cabin, this isolation. All of it had been constructed specifically to contain me until I was prepared for whatever came next. I had accepted the job because I was broken. I had accepted isolation because I wanted to remove myself from the world. But I had been selected for the position because the Park Service understood, at some level of institutional knowledge that they didn't fully admit to themselves, that broken people were the optimal offering. The realization didn't bring fear. It brought something closer to acceptance. I spent the remainder of the night adding final entries to the logbook. I documented the timeline of my descent into the strange communion I had developed with the wilderness around the cabin. I described the wrongness of the animals, the precision of the stalking, the evolution of the vocalizations into increasingly sophisticated approximations of human speech. I documented my own fear's dissolution, the strange peace that had emerged from the recognition that escape was neither possible nor, perhaps, desirable. When dawn came on October 15th, I found myself unable to determine how much time had actually passed. The cabin walls seemed to ripple slightly when I focused on them. The light filtering through the windows held colors that didn't appear in normal spectrum. The thermometer on the cabin's interior read a temperature that should have been lethal, yet I felt neither cold nor discomfort. I opened the door. The thing outside was barely recognizable as anything that had emerged from a single animal form. It was a composite, a synthesis of whatever creatures had circled the cabin in the months of autumn, filtered through a distortion that made it difficult to perceive directly. Legs that didn't align with any body plan. Eyes distributed asymmetrically across a shape that suggested fur or skin or neither. A mouth that opened in configurations that biological architecture shouldn't have permitted. It had, I understood, been gathering materials, building itself from the available components of the wildlife that had been rendered into component parts through the preceding months. The thing made a sound that was my name, or something close to it, using the vowel structures of my language but pronouncing it with the timing and emphasis of something fundamentally alien. I walked toward it, and as I did, I realized that the cabin behind me had begun to disappear. Not in the sense of becoming distant, but in the sense of ceasing to exist in ordinary space. The walls were becoming translucent, the interior fading into something that resembled sky but held more colors than sky should contain. The last thing I remember clearly is the understanding that I was being remade, my component parts being sorted and reclassified, my consciousness being unraveled to be reshaped into something new. It wasn't painful. It was almost the opposite. A sensation of being finally completely understood by something that had learned my language, my structure, my deepest patterns of thought, all in preparation for the moment when the isolation would finally end. The logbook remains in the cabin, or perhaps it exists somewhere else now, in whatever space the cabin occupies. Kasika eventually sent a recovery team after the helicopter weather windows finally passed in late October. They found the cabin empty. The logbook was on the table, complete with my final entries. The Park Service has likely archived that document. They've probably filed the incident under classification protocols and moved forward with the operation as planned. They'll probably send another ranger in the spring, perhaps someone equally desperate for isolation, perhaps someone equally broken. But if you read this, if this account reaches you through whatever means have allowed these words to be transcribed from the logbook's pages, understand something. The mountains are not merely geography. The cabin is not merely shelter, and the thing that waits in that particular stretch of Glacier National Park is not merely predatory. It's patient, and it's learned to speak our language so carefully, so well, that you won't even realize you're answering when it calls. My name is Keisho, a name given to me at birth by my Blackfeet grandmother. Though I've spent most of my adult life running from what it meant, the name means bear of the water. And when I was younger, I thought it sounded powerful, mythological even. Now, at 43 years old, having just accepted a position as the head ranger for the remote northern section of Glacier National Park, I understand the name carries a weight I'd never fully appreciated. Water finds darkness easily. So do bears. I took this job because I needed to disappear, not in the permanent sense, though I suppose I understand that possibility now. What I mean is, my life in Kalispell had become suffocating. 20 years in law enforcement had left me hollowed out, the kind of hollow that doesn't show on the surface but eats away at you from inside until you wake up one morning and don't recognize yourself in the mirror. My marriage had ended 3 years prior. My daughter Mercedes barely spoke to me anymore. She was 21 and had decided that my father's abandonment pattern was somehow genetic, something I'd passed down to her through biology rather than behavior. She wasn't entirely wrong. When the position opened up, a supervisory role managing the rangers who covered the most glacier area, including the remote cabin stations at Lake Macdonald and the high country stations, I applied almost on impulse. The job posting emphasized isolation, self-sufficiency, and commitment. To the hiring committee, I'm sure these were requirements for survival in the Montana wilderness. To me, they were a permission slip, a way to step outside the world that had chewed me up and found me flavorless. The cabin had been built in 1987 and renovated just once, in the early 2000s. It sat on a rise overlooking Lake Macdonald from the north shore, about 4 miles from the nearest maintained road by foot or via the supply boat that came once weekly. The structure itself was solid enough: log walls chinked with concrete, a metal roof that still held its color, a stone fireplace that dominated the main room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a gas stove, a bathroom with well water that tasted faintly of minerals, and something else I couldn't quite place. The elevation was 3,200 feet and the nearest ranger station manned during the day was 8 miles south. I moved in during the last week of August when the weather was still stable enough for long hikes, but the light was already changing. The quality of the sunlight in late summer at that elevation is something I'd almost forgotten from my childhood summers here with my grandmother. It's thin and golden, like old honey stretched through cheesecloth. It made everything look aged, including me. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window as I unpacked boxes, and the man looking back seemed to be from another era entirely. The first month was exactly what I needed. The job gave me structure: morning radio checks with the other rangers, trail maintenance, supply inventory, visitor safety briefings. I conducted searches for lost day hikers. Most turned out to be people who'd simply strayed from marked trails, confused by the way the terrain shifts and folds in that part of Montana. I found them within hours, usually near water sources where their panic logic told them to head. People follow water when they're lost. It's instinctive, like something lives in us that remembers when we were liquid, and we want to go home. The rangers who reported to me were competent enough. Marcus was a seasonal 26 years old, with the kind of relentless positivity that suggested he'd never truly suffered. Diane had been working the park for 8 years and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen the landscape change and adapted accordingly. There was also Garrett, a local Blackfeet who ran the ranger station at the west end, and 2 temporary employees named Voss and Reynolds who came on during peak season. By late September, most of the tourists had fled back to whatever lives they'd temporarily abandoned. The park became what it was meant to be: a vast, indifferent wilderness with a few humans scattered throughout it like seeds that hadn't taken root. The weather shifted from warm to something more ominous. Not quite cold yet, but with that edge to the air that comes when something in the ecosystem knows what's coming. The animals sensed it. I'd see elk moving down from the higher elevations in groups that seemed larger and more purposeful than the summer wandering. The bears grew aggressive about food. It was October when I first noticed the prints. I was hiking the Gunsight Pass Trail, checking for down timber and assessing whether it would need to remain closed through winter. The elevation gain at that section is brutal, 1,500 feet over 3 miles, and my knees were reminding me that my years in office chairs hadn't been kind to my joints. Around the 2-mile mark, where the trail climbs through a stand of whitebark pine and emerges briefly at a rocky outcrop, I found them. The prints were in the soft earth beside the trail where water seeps down from the higher slopes. At first I thought they belonged to a grizzly. The claws marks were deep and regular, and the overall dimensions were enormous. At least 14 inches across the palm print, maybe larger. But as I crouched to examine them more carefully, something felt wrong. The gait was wrong. Bears, even the largest males, have a certain proportion to their footfalls. These prints suggested a different kind of weight distribution. The pressure pattern of the claw marks indicated something that walked more vertically than a bear did. with the weight more concentrated in the heel and forefoot rather than spread across the pad. I'd been a ranger for 3 months. I knew Glacier's wildlife extensively. I knew the prints of grizzlies, black bears, mountain lions, wolves. I'd studied them in field guides, seen photographs, found tracks dozens of times. These prints were consistent with none of them. The logical part of my brain offered simple explanations. Unusual gait because the ground was soft and the animal was sinking further than expected. Large size because it was an exceptional specimen, possibly a male grizzly of unusual proportions. The claw marks could be explained by angle, by depth of substrate, by the individual variation that exists in all animals. I photographed the prints with my Ranger issue camera and continued the hike. I didn't mention them in my radio check that evening. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I already knew what everyone would say. Send them to resource management. Probably nothing, probably a bear, but they stayed with me. I found myself thinking about them in the dark hours of the morning, when the wind moved through the trees above the cabin and I lay awake listening. The lake below was dark those nights, a surface that reflected nothing. No stars had fallen into its water, no moon. Just the sense of a massive presence existing beneath what you could see. By early October, the weather had become unpredictable. Sudden cold fronts would sweep down from Canada, bringing snow that melted by afternoon only to refreeze after sunset. The park was in that transitional phase where it belonged to neither season, and the uncertainty of it created a kind of tension in the air. Visibility on the passes became poor. I had to close several higher elevation trails after a particularly fierce storm rolled through on the 9th, dumping 14 inches of heavy wet snow that pressed down on the whitebark pines so heavily that dozens of them bent nearly double. The supply boat was delayed that week. Radio communications with the park headquarters became spotty when the weather deteriorated. There were days when I couldn't reach anyone, when I was entirely alone in that cabin with nothing but the emergency radio and the sound of wind moving through canyons I couldn't see. It was during one of those days that I heard the sound. I can't easily describe it because human language operates on the assumption that sounds have categories. We understand howls, roars, screams. This was something that seemed to contain elements of all three and none of them. It came from somewhere across the lake, from the dark line of forest that formed the southern shore. It carried across the water with unnatural clarity, and it wasn't any sound that belonged to the animals of Glacier. I was in the cabin, reading by lamplight. I preferred the steadiness of the lamp to the harsh fluorescent overhead lighting, and the sound made me put the book down so quickly I lost my place. Every rational thought I possessed rushed forward to offer explanations. Wind through a canyon. An elk's distress call, unusual in its character. A mountain lion, though they were rare enough that few rangers ever heard one vocalize. Acoustic illusion created by the particular topography of the lake basin, making something familiar sound strange. But I knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, that none of these explanations were correct. I didn't go outside. I locked the cabin's front door, a habit I'd kept from my years in law enforcement but had largely abandoned in the solitude of the mountains, and let the fire in the fireplace burn down to embers. I sat in the dark and listened until the sound didn't come again, until the night returned to its normal silence. The normal silence of Glacier was profound. The absence of sound was its own kind of presence. In the morning, I radioed Diane at the West Station and asked, in what I hoped was a casual voice, whether she'd heard anything unusual during the night. The wind, she said, definitely just wind. Wind in the high country could make incredible sounds. It could almost sound like voices if you let it. I let it, but I also began making notes. Not official reports, I wasn't ready for that. Just observations in a small spiral notebook I kept beside the cabin's radio. Unusual prints, strange vocalizations, changes in animal behavior that seemed more pronounced than typical seasonal shifts. Elk congregating in unusual groups. Ravens circling the same section of forest every morning, their calls taking on a quality that suggested agitation rather than their normal communication patterns. The notebook would become important later, not because anyone would believe it, but because it would help me track when things began to shift in earnest. Winter came to Glacier with finality. The snows in early November were heavy and stayed, burying the lower elevation trails and making the high passes impassable. The park moved into its off-season rhythm. Most of the seasonal rangers departed. Diane stayed on through November. Garrett remained at his station. I was largely alone at the cabin, checking on supply deliveries, maintaining radio contact, and conducting the occasional welfare check on the few year-round residents scattered throughout the park's interior. The supply boat had difficulty navigating to the cabin dock by mid-November. Ice was forming along the edges of Lake Macdonald, despite the water's relative depth. The last supply run brought extra provisions because it was unclear when the next one would be possible. I stockpiled flour, canned goods, propane, batteries, medical supplies. I told myself it was rational preparedness. The truth was, I was afraid of being isolated completely. Isolation had seemed like a virtue when I had arrived. Now, as November deepened and the darkness came earlier each day, I understood that isolation was what happened when something removed you from protection. It wasn't enlightenment, it was exposure. The prince appeared again, this time on November 7th. I was checking on a section of trail near my cabin, looking for any signs that hikers had pushed past the closure signs despite the posted warnings. The prints were in the snow, maybe 4 hours old based on the way the edges had crystallized slightly. They descended from the higher elevation, moving downward toward the lake. The size was consistent with the earlier prints, though the gait pattern seemed different, more irregular, almost as though the animal had been moving through the deep snow with difficulty. There were about 50 yards where I could track them clearly. Then they disappeared, vanishing into a stand of trees where the snow beneath the canopy hadn't accumulated as heavily. I should have turned back. The standard protocol in situations like this was to report sightings of potential danger to resource management and let them handle investigation. I was too experienced a law enforcement officer not to know better. Instead, I followed them. The forest at that elevation in November is a specific kind of hostile. The trees are so close together that the sky becomes impossible to see. The snow load on the branches is heavy enough that you move slowly, constantly pushing weight away, alert for the possibility of a collapse that could bury you. The light that filters through is a sickly gray-green that makes depth perception difficult. Sound becomes strange in the snow. It's absorbed immediately, creating a silence so complete it feels like pressure in your ears. I followed the prints for maybe a quarter mile. They moved with purpose, following the contours of the land in a way that suggested intelligence guiding the movement. The creature had navigated around obstacles, selected routes that would minimize effort while still moving downward. I could see places where it had paused, where the snow was disturbed in a small circle as though something had stood still, considering direction. Then I found where it had tried to dig. There was a section where the snow and earth had been excavated, creating a small depression about 3 feet across and 18 inches deep. Claw marks raked through the frozen ground. Something had been searching for something in the earth. The marks were fresh enough that there was still exposed soil color showing rather than weathered gray. My heart rate had elevated significantly by that point. My breathing had become shallow. My brain was offering me options, all of them bad. I backed away from the digging site and returned to the trail. The prints were from a bear. It had to be. A grizzly had woken from torpor, though that was unusual behavior for November. A grizzly was searching for a food source before the real cold came. All of this was possible, was rational, was consistent with known animal behavior. I allowed myself to believe it, or at least to perform the act of believing it sufficiently well that I could return to my radio and file the obligatory report without my voice betraying my actual state of mind. Diane didn't sound particularly concerned. She'd noted unusual grizzly activity all month. Probably something was making them aggressive, maybe a change in the acorn crop or an unusually large herd of elk moving through. She'd contact resource management. It was probably nothing. That evening, I made a mistake. I decided to research what I'd seen, and in doing so, I opened a door that professionalism had taught me to keep firmly closed. I had limited internet access at the cabin, satellite, unreliable, slow as cold honey, but I had enough connectivity to search. It took me about 3 hours of research to realize I'd been looking at something that matched descriptions in folklore, in indigenous history, in the testimonies of missing persons. The Wendigo occupies a specific place in North American indigenous traditions, particularly among Algonquin-speaking peoples. Though Glacier National Park sat on Blackfeet territory, and the Blackfeet had their own folklore creatures, the Wendigo legends were widespread enough across the northern continent that I'd heard of them. A creature associated with extreme hunger, with the desperation of winter starvation, with the transformation of human need into something predatory and wrong. The creature was said to be immense, impossibly tall, with a frame that was more bone than substance. It moved like something that had forgotten how to be animal but couldn't quite manage human either. I closed the browser on my laptop after midnight and sat in the dark, listening to the fire in the fireplace settle and collapse into itself. The rational part of my brain, the part that had served me well in law enforcement, insisted that I was overlaying folklore onto animal tracks, letting my isolation feed my imagination. The part of me that came from my grandmother, the part that had always been more attuned to the space between explanation and mystery, knew better. By November 20th, I'd stopped sleeping normally. I slept in fragments, an hour here, 2 hours there, always interrupted by small sounds that my hypervigilant nervous system interpreted as threats. The wind became everything. Every noise outside the cabin was the wind. The prints I found, and I continued to find them, though I stopped photographing or reporting them, were the result of the wind moving branches against snow, in patterns that suggested tracks. Except they were prints. They were moving in a pattern that suggested hunting behavior. I found them near the cabins of the 2 year-round residents living 8 miles south. Found them circling a supply shed that belonged to a Forest Service crew that overwintered in the park. Found them once in the snow directly outside my cabin window. That one was the worst. The print was pressed so deeply into the snow that the underlying ground showed. Whatever had made it had been standing there looking in, close enough to the window that it could have seen the reflection of my lamp if it understood reflection. If it understood windows. I didn't report that print. On November 23rd, I received a radio call from the park superintendent's office. A hiker had gone missing. Her name was Patricia Olmsted, age 64, experienced enough that she shouldn't have gotten into trouble. She'd gone out on a day hike from the Loop Trail area, still in the park but 20 miles south of my location. She was due back before dark. She hadn't returned. A search team was being assembled. They wanted me to come down, to cover the northern trails in case she'd backtracked and headed in my direction. I said I would. What I didn't say is that I knew she wouldn't be found, not alive, not whole. I knew this with a certainty that had no basis in evidence, grounded only in the calculus of prints and sounds and the shape of hunger written in the snow. The search operation brought 7 of us together. Myself, Diane, 2 ranger trainees from the main station, a volunteer coordinator named Judith, and a local sheriff's deputy named Morrison. We met at the Loop parking area on November 24th, gathering around a topographic map in the ranger station while coffee cooled in ceramic cups. Patricia had last been seen at approximately 9 in the morning when she'd parked her car and started on what she'd told the parking attendant would be a 4-hour loop hike. She was experienced, she'd hiked Glacier before multiple times, she had proper gear, she'd left a detailed itinerary. She was not the type to disappear, which meant she had disappeared, which meant something had taken her. The search protocol was methodical. We divided the Loop Trail and surrounding areas into zones. We'd move through each zone systematically, looking for signs of distress, abandoned gear, anything that might indicate her route deviation. The training rangers brought search dogs, German shepherds trained to alert on human remains. The dogs were good, responsive, professional. Neither of them wanted to work the assigned territory. Both dogs repeatedly refused to move into the northern reaches of their zones, pulling back toward their handlers, showing signs of distress that the handlers' reassurances couldn't ease. Eventually, one of the trainee rangers made the decision to remove them, suggesting the dogs sensed a predator and were unwilling to track prey that could become hunter. "There's big cats in here," one of them offered by way of explanation. Morrison nodded like this was sensible. Diane and I exchanged a look that contained information we couldn't articulate in this professional context. We didn't find Patricia that day, or the day after. By day 3 of the search, the operation had taken on that familiar exhaustion that comes when you're looking for someone who no longer exists in a way that involves being found. The searchers move slower, their attention fragments. The topography that seemed navigable becomes labyrinthine. After 5 days, the formal search was suspended. A few of us continued to check the trails, but the momentum was gone. Patricia Olmsted had joined Glacier's growing roster of missing persons, 2 in the last decade, 4 in the 2 decades before that. Missing meaning absent from identification, absent from discovery, absent from closure. During that week, I made another mistake. I told Diane we were in the ranger station on November 28th, the day the formal search was suspended. I'd driven down from my cabin for the first time in a week, needing radio communication that was more stable than the satellite connection. Diane was filing reports, her methodical handwriting filling forms with the information we'd collected. I sat across from her at the small desk and said, quietly, "I've found tracks." She didn't look up from the form. "Where?" "Northern section, multiple locations, over several weeks." "Grizzly?" "I don't think so." Now she looked up. Diane's eyes were intelligent and cautious. She'd been a ranger long enough to know that the mountains held mysteries that didn't resolve cleanly, but she was also professional enough to know the dangers of letting those mysteries influence your official reports. What do you think it is? I hesitated. To say it aloud was to commit to something I wasn't prepared to commit to. But I'd spent nearly 2 months not sleeping, not eating normally, watching the forest and feeling watched in return. The weight of that observation had become nearly physical, something that hunts like a predator with human-level intelligence about how to approach its prey. Diane closed the form in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it. Kehoa, we've lost one person. That's tragedy, but it's not unusual for Glacier. People die in mountains, people go missing. It's the contract you make when you come to wilderness. I know that. Then you know that if you file a report about something hunting in the park based on tracks and sounds, what happens next is a state investigation, probably a closure of sections of the park, media attention that turns it into spectacle, and ultimately nothing. No creature will be found. Patricia will still be gone. And your reputation as a ranger will be compromised enough that you probably won't work in law enforcement again. It was delivered without malice. It was delivered as fact. And it was entirely correct. So what do? You do your job. You monitor the trails. You report anything that presents clear danger to visitors. You don't report folklore and instinct, no matter how strong the instinct is. I understood. I'd expected this response. But understanding and accepting are different operations, and something in me broke a little when I heard her say it. Not broke, exactly. Corroded. Became less interested in fighting the loneliness. The next day I went to see Garrett at his station. Garrett was 71 years old and had been working for Glacier since 1974. He was Blackfeet, and he'd grown up in the area surrounding the park. More than anyone else I'd met, he existed in the landscape with a kind of comfortable knowledge that suggested he understood the language the mountains spoke. His station was small, built in the 1960s, isolated enough that I had to hike 2 miles to reach it from the nearest vehicle access. The winter snow made the hike slow. When I arrived, Garrett was outside splitting kindling, moving with the kind of deliberate efficiency that comes from doing the same task for decades. Kehoa, he said by way of greeting. It's been a while. I wanted to ask you about something. Of course, I told him what I'd seen. I used the word Wendigo because I needed a name for it, and because the territory we covered was part of the larger Algonquin cultural area even though it sat on Blackfeet land. I told him about Patricia. I told him about the prints and the digging and the sound across the lake. Garrett listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned his axe against the shed and gestured for me to follow him inside. His cabin had maps on the walls, topographic maps dating back 50 years, hand-annotated with notes in his precise handwriting. There were crosses marked on them, maybe a dozen throughout the park territory. Dates next to them, years stretching back to the 1980s. I've been noting things too, he said quietly. Not officially, never officially, but I've worked this land long enough to know it's not entirely ours. We occupy it. But we don't own it. Why didn't you say something? To who? Who would believe me? It was the same question I'd asked myself. We stood in silence, looking at the maps, at the scattered marks of absence that he'd been recording while I'd been trying not to record anything. It hunts in cycles, Garrett said. Not every year. Sometimes there's 5 years of nothing, then something, then nothing again. My father told me, before he died, that the creature comes when the wilderness is disrupted. When we bring too many people, when we try to domesticate the landscape. The creature, he said, is what happens when the mountains decide they don't want to be shaped by human ambition. That's folklore, yes. But even folklore is a way of knowing. It's knowledge that wasn't tested in laboratory conditions but was tested across generations of people who lived in actual landscape and had to develop accurate understandings or die. I wanted to reject this. I wanted to maintain my professional skepticism. But I'd been waiting for someone to help me understand what I was experiencing, and here was someone offering an explanation that actually contained the weight of what I'd encountered. What do? I asked again, this time genuinely asking. You survive the winter. That's the only thing you do. You keep to your cabin when you should keep to your cabin. You don't investigate sounds or tracks. You don't help it, and you don't assume it will help you. When spring comes, you decide whether you want to stay. December brought sustained cold that settled into Glacier with the weight of something that wouldn't leave. The temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there. The lake froze entirely, first a skin of ice around the edges, then expanding from the shores until even the center developed a sufficient freeze to hold weight. I tested it carefully one afternoon and walked out about 50 feet. The ice was clear enough to see down into the water beneath, showing nothing but darkness and the suggestion of infinite depth. I'd stopped leaving the cabin except for absolute necessities. I'd chopped and stacked enough wood in November to sustain me through a brutal winter. My supplies were sufficient. The propane would last. I could, theoretically, remain here indefinitely without leaving the structure. I wasn't sleeping much. Maybe 2 or 3 hours a night, broken into fragments, always light enough that any sound would wake me. The darkness at that elevation in December is profound. It begins at 4 in the afternoon and doesn't lift until 7:30 the next morning. 13.5 hours of darkness every single day. The moon moves through its phases in that darkness, sometimes providing enough light to cast shadows, sometimes obscured entirely by cloud cover. It was during one of the moon-dark nights that I heard it again. The sound. It came closer than it had before, not from across the lake but from somewhere near the shoreline, maybe a quarter mile away. It was longer this time, more elaborate. It had qualities almost like language, like something struggling to form words with a throat never meant for human speech. There were peaks and valleys to it, almost melodic in structure, but the melody belonged to something that had never heard human music and was building the concept from first principles alone. I sat in the dark cabin, every muscle contracted, every sense focused outward. I had my service revolver in the cabin. I'd kept it from my law enforcement days, maintained it, kept it loaded. I retrieved it now, not because I had any confidence in its efficacy against whatever was making that sound, but because the weight of it in my hand was a comfort. A fiction of control in a situation where control had become theoretical at best. The sound didn't come again that night, but I knew it was close. I could feel it the way you can feel that someone is watching you even when your eyes are closed. The mountains had become an extension of its body. It moved through them as though they were water. Christmas came. I didn't mark it. I had some food that was better than the usual rations, and I ate well enough. I turned on my radio periodically to hear human voices from the ranger stations and the park office. Diane mentioned that she'd applied for a transfer to a different park somewhere in the southwest. Better weather, she said. Fewer memories, fewer reasons to stay. Garrett maintained his station through December, though he admitted over the radio that the isolation was acute even for him. We didn't discuss what he'd told me about cycles and disruption and the creature's relationship to human intrusion. We maintained professional pretense that those conversations hadn't happened. On December 28th, Morrison, the sheriff's deputy, called the ranger station asking if I could help with a search in the Northern Territory. Hunters had spotted something in the upper elevations, a cave that showed recent signs of habitation. Could I check it out, assess whether it needed investigation? Every reasonable part of my being said no. The weather was deteriorating toward what the forecast called a significant winter storm. The location Morrison described was in the high country where snow was already 4 feet deep. Going there alone was a risk that violated every safety protocol. And I knew, with that same certainty that had guided me since November, what I would find in that cave. I'll head out tomorrow, I heard myself say. That night I prepared. I packed supplies, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a flare gun, rope. I checked my revolver again, cleaned it, confirmed the action was smooth and the bullets were seated properly. I left a note in the cabin stating my intended route and estimated return time. If something happened to me, at least there would be a search grid rather than another disappearance that would become folklore. The hike began at dawn on December 29th. The sky was gray with the kind of density that suggested snow within hours. The wind was coming from the northwest, carrying the particular cold that belongs to weather systems arriving from the Arctic. The trees were bent under their snow load, creating passages that required me to duck and navigate carefully, backtracking when routes became impassable. Morrison's hunters had left a marker at the cave entrance, a line of bright orange tape tied between trees. The cave itself was substantial, maybe 15 feet across the opening, with a depth that disappeared into shadow. I stood at the entrance for a long time, not wanting to go inside but knowing I would. The interior of the cave smelled wrong. Not of animals exactly, but of something that carried the mineral smell of earth mixed with the scent of predation. There were bones scattered on the cave floor, many bones. Animal mostly, elk and behorn sheep and smaller creatures whose identities I couldn't determine in the dim light filtering through the entrance. But there were also larger bones, human-sized bones partially buried in the cave debris bearing marks that suggested they'd been handled by something with claws. Patricia Olmsted was there, but not in a way that would allow identification through anything except the context of her disappearance. What remained was distributed across the cave floor, incorporated into the landscape of the creature's occupation. I stood for perhaps 5 minutes, watching my breath form in the cold, understanding that I would need to report this, but also understanding that the reporting would change my life in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. It was as I was backing toward the cave entrance that I heard the sound, not from outside the cave, but from deeper within it. In the darkness beyond where the light penetrated, a sound of movement, of weight shifting, of something that had been resting becoming aware of my presence. I moved faster than thought toward the entrance. I didn't run, the ground was too treacherous, but I moved with purpose and speed, and I didn't stop until I was 50 feet away from the cave, down the slope and out of sight of the opening. The thing didn't come out of the cave immediately, but I could sense its attention. I could feel it considering whether it was worth the effort to pursue what had entered its domain. After several minutes, I heard it shift again. The sense of attention withdrew. I hiked back down the mountain in conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. The snow had begun, heavy and wet. The wind was increasing. I used the orange markers the hunters had left to guide myself back toward the marked trail. What I discovered, about 2 hours into my descent, was that someone had deliberately removed the orange markers. Not all of them, just enough to create confusion about which direction led down. I noticed the pattern because I was trained to notice patterns, because I'd spent my career looking for signs of deliberate human action beneath surfaces that seemed accidental. The creature was hurting me. I stopped moving and allowed myself to sit on a deadfall, fully processing the implication. A predator that could strategize, a predator that understood human behavior well enough to recognize that removing physical landmarks would create the kind of disorientation that makes prey make mistakes. A predator that was playing with me the way a cat plays with prey. I had two choices. I could panic and run, which would make me easier to track and catch. Or I could be methodical, use my training, navigate by instrument rather than by landmark. I had a compass. I had topographic knowledge. I could move down the mountain using orienteering principles that didn't depend on marked trails. I chose methodical. I got up, disoriented as I was, and I navigated by compass bearing and terrain reading. It took longer than the marked trail would have. I made mistakes, poor route choices that required backtracking, approaches to steep sections that forced detours. But I kept moving downward, and eventually I could see the tree line shifting from high-elevation whitebark to the denser forest of the lower elevations. Behind me, I could hear it, moving through the forest like it was nothing, like gravity didn't apply the way it applied to things with conventional weight and structure. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I moved with everything I had, driven by the knowledge that to stop was to die. I reached the ranger station at the west end of the loop trail just as full darkness descended. Diane was there, and her face when she saw me, soaked, bleeding from cuts on my face and hands, having clearly been running, told me what I must look like. I told her everything. The cave, Patricia's remains, the creature's deliberate manipulation of the environment, the sound of it moving through the forest. I told her that it knew how to think, how to strategize, how to make decisions about when to pursue and when to allow prey to escape. I told her that it was in the mountains with us, and that snow and cold and darkness were its element. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she made me coffee and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and she said, "We need to call this in. They won't believe it. They will believe that you found human remains in a cave that needs investigation. The rest of it, maybe they won't understand. But the evidence is there. Patricia is there." It took 3 days for the weather to clear enough for a helicopter to arrive. The official search of the cave revealed exactly what I'd found. Scattered human remains identified as Patricia Olmsted through dental records and DNA analysis. The official report attributed them to a complex animal predation event, most likely from a large grizzly with aberrant behavior. There would be discussions about bear management, about whether the park needed more active culling programs. No one would look too closely at the nature of the predation, the way the bones had been arranged, the evidence of intelligence in the handling. No one would find the cave that had already been abandoned by whatever lived there, that had moved on to other territory now that its winter residence had been compromised. I submitted my resignation effective December 31st. I couldn't leave immediately. The weather and the logistics required time. But I was clear about my intention. I would finish my duties, ensure the cabin was properly closed, document everything that needed to be documented. But I would leave Glacier. It took me 3 months to complete the transition. During that time, the cave was investigated, the remains were examined, the official record was written. I participated in all of it, providing information that seemed reasonable enough that no one questioned the gaps between what I reported and what I knew. Garrett came to visit the cabin in late January. We sat in front of the fire, and he asked me a simple question. Did you see it? No. I heard it. I felt it. But I never saw it directly. He nodded like this made sense to him. My father said that seeing it is usually the last thing you do. So if you didn't see it, you were meant to survive. Why would it want to let me survive? Maybe because you're like your name suggests. You belong to the water. Maybe it recognized something of the landscape in you. Something that's not entirely apart from what it is. Or maybe it was testing you, and you passed. I left Glacier in late March when the snow was receding from the lower elevations and the promise of spring was beginning to move through the landscape. Mercedes came to help me pack my belongings. She didn't ask me why I was leaving so suddenly after taking a job I'd claimed to want deeply. She helped me load boxes into a truck, and she asked questions about the park itself rather than about my failure to make the job work. Before I left, I visited Diane at her station. She was already preparing to transfer to a park in New Mexico. She was leaving Glacier too, though she maintained publicly that it was because of better opportunities, better weather, family reasons. Do you think it's still there? She asked me. Yes. Do you think it's hunting? I think it's always hunting. I think it is, fundamentally, hunger. Hunger that wears the shape of something alive. Something that was once maybe human or could become human under the right conditions. And I think it exists in the relationship between wilderness and the people who try to live in it. As long as we're here, it will be here. As long as we're here, it will hunt. I'm back in Kalispell now. I took the civil service exams again, and I'm working as a detective with the police department. Mercedes and I have coffee once a month. It's not much, but it's something. The job is stable. The city feels small and comprehensible after Glacier. But I don't sleep well. I still wake at night, alert to sounds. I still imagine the weight of things moving through darkness. I still think about that cave, and about the bones I found there, and about what Patricia's final moments must have been like when she understood that the danger had intelligence, that her death meant something to the thing that caused it. And I still occasionally hike. I do it locally, in smaller mountains, in areas where there are trails and marked paths and other people nearby. But even then, in the moments when I'm alone in forest, when I can't see anyone else and the trees close around me, I listen. I wait for the sound that I heard across Lake Macdonald. I wait to see whether the thing I escaped from in December has any interest in pursuing what ran from it. I suspect that one day it will. I suspect that my grandmother named me Bear of the Water because she knew something about what would be drawn to me. That water finds darkness. That bears belong to places untouched by permanent human claim. And that some debts are paid not in a single moment of reckoning but across a lifetime of waiting in the dark. I'm still waiting. I took the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. Not literally, though there were nights I wondered if that wouldn't have solved everything. I needed to disappear into something vast and indifferent, something that wouldn't ask questions about the life I'd left behind in Missoula. Divorce papers, a child support agreement I couldn't afford, a custody arrangement that made me feel like I was losing my mind by increments. My name is Dakota, and I became a park ranger because the position required 6 months of consecutive work before I could transfer elsewhere. The park hired me in late September, right when the summer tourists thinned to almost nothing. They needed someone willing to work the shoulder season when the days shortened and the maintenance crews had already begun winterizing the backcountry routes. My supervisor, a woman named Iris with permanently squinted eyes from decades of mountain sun, handed me a map my first day and pointed to a section of the park's North Territory. Your sector, she said. You'll be based out of Raven Cabin on the eastern shore of Gunsight Lake. Stock it yourself. You're responsible for trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, and emergency response for anything within a 15-mile radius. It's late in the season, so you won't have much foot traffic. Mostly you'll be alone. That was the selling point. I wanted alone. I wanted the kind of solitude that erases the memory of a man who can't stay sober long enough to keep promises. I wanted to live somewhere that had no idea who I was or what I'd failed at. The drive to Raven Cabin took 5 hours from the main station at Lake Macdonald. The cabin sat at the edge of the wilderness, about 200 yards from Gunsight Lake, which stretched like an unpolished mirror between steep granite walls. The water was a shade of blue that seemed almost artificial in its intensity. On clear days you could see the glaciers themselves perched high above, though by September they were diminishing into themselves like animals preparing for hibernation. I spent my first week stalking the cabin. Solar panels provided minimal electricity. A wood-burning stove supplied heat. Water came from a treated well. The previous ranger, a man named Vex according to the logbook, had left equipment scattered as though he'd departed in haste. His final entry, dated June 15th, read, "No more west perimeter. Something's wrong with the trails past Mill Creek. Recommending closure. I should have asked questions. Instead, I scrubbed the entry from my mind the way I was scrubbing everything else that required examination. The cabin became my entire world. I maintained the trails during the day, made reports to Iris twice weekly, and spent my evenings listening to the mountains. That's what people don't understand about deep wilderness. It's never quiet. The quiet is just sound arranged differently. Wind through stone channels created frequencies that made your teeth ache. Water moving through hidden channels produced distant groans. Wildlife had conversations in the darkness that carried across miles of thin air. 3 weeks into my assignment, I found the first animal. It was a mule deer, found along the Kinta Creek Trail, about 8 miles from the cabin. The positioning was what struck me first. The animal wasn't simply dead, it had been arranged. Its back legs pointed west toward the ridge. Its front legs pointed toward the water. Its head was turned completely backward, and the bone structure of the neck showed no signs of breaking. It was more like someone had twisted the skull around on a pivot point that shouldn't exist. I reported it to Iris. She told me to file the observation in the weekly report and move on. Animals die in unusual positions all the time, she said through the radio. Predators struggle, disease, sometimes they just collapse in strange ways. But the antlers. I couldn't stop thinking about the antlers. They'd been filed down to nubs, not snapped off but deliberately abraded. That detail kept me awake that night, listening to the cabin settle around me. By mid-October, I'd found 7 more animals. A black bear that had been flayed along its left side while remaining otherwise undamaged. 3 elk that appeared to have been emptied from inside out, their hides still perfect, but their frames hollow and light as dried grass. A coyote whose jaw had been dislocated and reset at an angle that should have made breathing impossible, yet something in the arrangement suggested the animal had survived that way for days. I stopped reporting them. The weather was turning mean. Early storms came sweeping down from the north, bringing snow that stayed. The high passes began closing. I could feel the season contracting around me, the windows of safe passage narrowing down to nothing. In another month, my sector would be inaccessible. In another month, I would be alone in a way that made true solitude look like a crowded room. It was during the first heavy snow, around October 20th, that I started finding the tracks. They appeared first near the lake's eastern shore, about 200 yards from the cabin. I found them while checking the water access point, making sure the winterization equipment was secure. The prints were large, roughly humanoid but wrong in a way my mind struggled to process. The stride length was impossible for a human frame. The depth of impression suggested significant weight, but the spacing indicated movement that was too fluid, too economical. Something between a person and an animal had walked along the frozen shore. I followed the tracks for perhaps 200 yards. They moved with purpose, parallel to the water but never approaching it directly. The prints eventually disappeared where the snow became too churned and uneven to preserve detail, near a granite outcropping that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. That night, something moved around the cabin. I heard it at 3 a.m., a sound like fingernails against the wooden slats of the outer wall. Not scratching, feeling, like something running its appendages across the surface to test the structure, the gaps, the weak points. I had all the lights on inside, but they did nothing to penetrate the darkness beyond the windows. The darkness outside was absolute and present, a physical thing that pressed against the glass. The sound stopped around 4 a.m. I waited until first light before stepping outside, and I found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no marks on the walls. Just the pressed-down area where something had stood for an extended period near the northern corner, right where the wind had blown the snow almost clean of the deck area. October turned into November. The park was effectively closed to casual visitors. Iris stopped requesting my twice-weekly reports and moved to monthly check-ins, mostly about equipment status rather than wildlife observations. I had become a ghost filing reports about ghosts, but I wasn't alone. The evidence accumulated. I found more tracks, always near the cabin, always at night. I found scat in shapes that belonged to no animal in the wildlife registry. I found trees debarked in precise, geometric patterns that suggested intent rather than hunger. One day I discovered every window on the west side of the cabin had been covered with something, not from the outside, but from the inside, where no one had been. That was when I realized it wasn't just watching, it was learning. I kept a detailed log of the incidents written in a notebook I hid beneath the floorboards. Professional distance was becoming impossible to maintain. This thing, whatever it was, had moved beyond the periphery of my days. It had become the central fact of my existence. I would walk the trails with my radio on, letting anyone listening know I was present and alive. I would conduct the maintenance checks that were increasingly just excuses to convince myself that the wilderness still operated under rules I could understand. The animal deaths had stopped. That was perhaps the most disturbing development. For weeks the pattern had been consistent. Now nothing. It was as if the learning phase had concluded. As if something had determined that the more subtle form of communication was more effective. Early November brought a missing persons report that changed everything. A hiker named Marcus Brennan had failed to return from a solo expedition into the park's interior. He'd last been seen near the CA Pass trailhead, roughly 15 miles from my sector. The search began immediately, coordinated by Iris and a team of seasonal rangers who came out from Lake Macdonald with dogs and specialized equipment. I participated in the search because I had to. We covered 40 square miles over 5 days, calling out Brennan's name into the vast indifference of the wilderness, checking every gully and rock formation, every possible shelter. The dogs found nothing, no trace, no clothing, no body. It was as though the man had simply ceased to exist. On the 4th day, I discovered a campsite about 2 miles from my sector boundary, in the direction of the west perimeter that Vex had recommended closing. The site was recent, probably from within the last week. There was a tent carefully folded, a sleeping bag, rolled and stored, food canisters, unopened, everything arranged with meticulous precision, everything except the center of the camp. That's where the clothing was. Pants, shirt, underwear, socks, boots, all positioned as though on an invisible body. The arrangement was exact in a way that went beyond simple placement, every seam aligned perfectly with the ground, every edge parallel to the next. The clothing formed the shape of a person lying down, arms at the sides, legs extended. I photographed everything and reported the find to Iris. The official story became that Brennan had probably hiked further than planned, misjudged distance and daylight, and gotten caught in unfamiliar terrain during the sudden weather change that had moved in that evening. His body, they theorized, was likely in some deep ravine or buried under a snowdrift. A tragic accident, not uncommon in a park of this size. The search was called off on day 6. Iris came out to the cabin to debrief me in person, the first time I'd seen her face to face since my initial orientation. She looked older than I remembered, and there was something in her expression that made me understand she'd known something about the west perimeter before she assigned it to me. "You've been doing good work," she said, standing in the cabin with snow still clinging to her jacket. "Thorough observations. By-the-book responses. That's what we need out here." "The previous ranger," I said. "Vex, what happened to him?" Iris took a long time answering. She looked out the window toward the lake, where the water had begun forming a skin of ice along the edges. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful and measured. "He worked his season and moved on. Like they all do. This place isn't for everyone. It requires a certain kind of acceptance." "Acceptance of what?" "Of the fact that there are places in this park that predate us. Places that have their own logic." Vex understood that. That's why he requested reassignment, and why he's still alive. She left before dark, driving back toward Lake Macdonald and whatever civilization waited there. I watched her vehicle disappear around the bend in the road, and I understood that no help was coming. Whatever was happening in my sector was considered acceptable loss. I was acceptable loss. By mid-November, the snow covered everything. The trails became invisible beneath 6 feet of accumulation. The world shrank to the immediate vicinity of the cabin. I made daily trips to the lake to bring water, to the woodshed to bring firewood, to the perimeter to maintain the fiction that I was still performing my duties. The tracks grew bolder. I found them inside the cabin's covered porch one morning, pressed into the frost that had accumulated on the wooden boards. They came up the steps, circled the front door 3 times, and then receded down into the yard. The prints were larger now, roughly the size of a human hand, but with digits that were too long and arranged in a configuration that was anatomically impossible. The fur, and yes, there was fur, bristles matted down into the frost, was a color I couldn't quite define. Gray but not gray. Brown but not brown. A color that seemed to shift depending on the angle of the light. I began to see it moving at the edge of my vision during the day. Never directly, never when I turned to look, just a presence in the peripheral field, something large and bipedal that moved with a fluidity that should have been impossible given the depth of snow. Once, I thought I saw it from the lake, a silhouette against the granite wall on the far shore. The proportions were close to human but fundamentally altered. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long. The head, when I could focus on it, arranged with all the features facing vaguely forward, but in a configuration that didn't match any predator or scavenger I knew. My psychological state was deteriorating. I knew that even as it was happening, I would catch myself performing actions and have no memory of deciding to perform them. I would find myself standing outside the cabin with no recollection of opening the door. Once I discovered I'd walked to the lake and back, a round trip of half a mile, with no consciousness of the journey. My footprints were clear in the snow, paired with something else, something that had walked beside me, step for step, maintaining a distance of exactly 6 feet. The logbook Vex had left behind began to make sense. I understood now why his final entries had become increasingly fragmented. It learns faster than should be possible. Watches, copies, remembers, found myself making its movements in the morning. Caught myself imitating its breath. It's already inside. Different definition of inside than I thought. Not through walls, through knowing. If it takes your shape, you're already dead. You just don't know it yet. Don't light the fire after dark. It uses the light against you. Uses your own vision to hunt you. I was reading the words of a man documenting his own dissolution. And I understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that I was following the same path. The creature, I had stopped trying to call it an animal or use euphemisms, began appearing closer to the cabin. I would see it standing at the tree line during the day, making no effort to hide. It was learning that I no longer had the will to run. It was learning that fear, after a certain point, becomes indistinguishable from acceptance. One evening, I woke to find it standing in the cabin. Not outside, inside, in the room with me. It was standing at the foot of my bed, silhouetted against the faint light from the dying fire. The proportions were closer to human now, or perhaps I had simply stopped expecting them to be alien. The face was almost a face. The mouth was almost a mouth. "You're welcome here," it said. The voice was wrong, layered with frequencies that made the walls vibrate. It sounded like wind through a canyon, like distant thunder, like a choir singing every note simultaneously. But underneath that, underneath the wrongness, there was something almost kind about it. "What are you?" I asked. "I'm what was here before the name. I'm what remains after the meaning. I'm what walks when the sun sleeps." It was using my words, or words that fit my context, shaped by whatever it had learned from watching me, living in proximity to my thoughts and my fears. "Why here? Why me? You came alone. You came because you were already broken. You came because you wanted to cease in every way except the physical. I came to show you that cessation is not what you think. Cessation is transformation. Cessation is becoming something else." The creature moved closer. Not with intention, but with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. The smell hit me then, not foul, but fundamentally other, a scent that belonged to no creature on this earth. Copper and stone. Frozen things thawing. The exhalation of caves that had never seen light. "Don't fight," it said. "Fighting extends the duration. Acceptance is immediate." I should have been terrified. Some part of me registered that this should be the moment of maximum fear. But the conversation had drained something from me, or it had drained something into me. The boundary between observer and observed was becoming permeable. I could feel its breath moving across my skin, and it felt like my own breath, returning to me from the future. November passed into the first weeks of December. The snow deepened. The world beyond the immediate vicinity of the cabin became entirely theoretical. I had not made contact with Iris in 6 weeks. My reports, when I filed them, were brief and entirely fictional. Temperature readings, snow accumulation rates, no wildlife incidents, everything nominal. The truth was, I had stopped being entirely present in my own experience. I would conduct my ranger duties automatically, moving through the motions while something else occupied the space of my consciousness. The creature was with me constantly now, though not always visible. I could feel it the way you feel your own pulse when you pay attention to it. A presence, a frequency, a familiar wrongness. I began leaving the cabin at night and walking into the forest. These walks should have been impossible, given the snow depth and the complete darkness of the wilderness, but they felt inevitable. The creature, I had begun thinking of it by the name that it thought of itself, though the name was not a word in any human language, moved with me. The other animals had disappeared entirely. There were no tracks but ours, no bird sound, no distant elk bugle, just the wind and the snow and the two of us moving through the white darkness as if we were the only things real. During one of these walks, the creature took me to a place I hadn't seen before. It was a cave mouth, barely visible because it blended with a granite outcropping that was indistinguishable from surrounding rock. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber that should not have existed given the geology I understood. "This is old," the creature said. "Older than your park, older than your nation, older than the words your people use to describe old things." The walls of the chamber were covered in marks. Not recent marks, these had the quality of things that had been there for thousands of years. They were shapes that suggested bodies but not human bodies, configurations that seemed to imply transformation, frames within frames, layers of figures occupying the same space simultaneously. "How many?" I asked. "Centuries. Your centuries. My centuries are different. Are they all dead?" The creature's response was not words but a sensation that moved through me, a understanding that arrived fully formed and devastating. The people whose marks covered these walls had not died. They had transformed. They had become something else. They were still here, in a manner of speaking. They were part of the mountain. They were part of the air and the stone and the patterns of weather that moved across this range. "Is that what you want for me?" "I want what you already are. I want you to stop fighting the transformation. You began it the moment you decided to disappear. You asked the world to forget you. Now the world is obliging." We returned to the cabin as dawn broke. The snow had an unusual quality in the morning light. I found myself seeing the shadow patterns in new ways, as if the snow were translucent and I could perceive depth beneath the surface. In the snow, I could see the faint outlines of other figures, other hikers, other rangers, other people who had come to Glacier seeking solitude and found something far more complete. Marcus Brennan was there, at the edge of the lake. He turned to look at me, and his face was almost intact, preserved in the snow like a photograph. He was smiling. Iris appeared later that morning. She came alone, driving all the way from Lake Macdonald in a vehicle that seemed to move through the snow without resistance. She had a hospital clipboard in her hands, and a look of administrative resignation. "They need your official report," she said. "The one you're going to file when you leave, which is tomorrow." "I'm leaving? You were transferred 3 weeks ago. There was a position opening at Lake Macdonald. You requested it. You were approved. Tomorrow morning, you drive out, and in 2 weeks you submit your resignation." "I don't remember requesting a transfer." "You did. You sent the email. I have a copy." She handed me a printout. The email was from my account. The words were in my voice. The request was legitimate in every measurable way, but I had no memory of writing it. "What about this?" I asked, gesturing toward the world outside, toward the creature that I now understood was not a creature but a process, a form of consciousness that existed in the space between human understanding and something far older and more patient. "That," Iris said, "is not your responsibility anymore. That was Vex's responsibility and now it's someone else's. That's how this place works. It cycles people through, it learns from each one, it becomes more effective at the transformation process. Eventually it will be efficient enough that it won't need the intermediate stage of human dissolution. It will simply reach out and convert directly." "Is that what happened to you?" Iris smiled, and her smile was the smile of someone looking at you from a very great distance. "I was the first ranger here. I've been here for 43 years. I just change appearances periodically, so the administration doesn't get suspicious. The creature and I have come to an understanding. I let it practice on people, and it lets me keep this form and this job. It's a reasonable arrangement. Why are you telling me this?" "Because I need you to understand what's coming. In 6 months or a year you're going to start changing. The transformation isn't complete for you yet. It's still processing how to integrate human consciousness with its own way of being. You might have another transfer request, another position, another isolated post, or you might just feel the call to come back, but you will return. They always do." The next morning, I packed my possessions and drove away from Glacier National Park. The highway seemed unreal, too empty, too orderly. I found myself having to think consciously about how to drive, about how hands manipulated steering wheels and feet managed pedals. By the time I reached the city, I was exhausted from the effort of maintaining the illusion of being human. I'm sitting in a coffee shop in Missoula, typing this account on a computer that belongs to a public library. My custody arrangement with my ex-wife has been revoked. I've taken a new job with the Forest Service, assigned to a remote sector of the Flathead National Forest. I've been living in an apartment for 3 months and I can feel it beginning. The way my limbs want to move differently. The way my senses are becoming attuned to frequencies that humans aren't supposed to hear. At night, I dream of the cave with the transformed marks on the walls. In the dreams, my outline is there too, in the stone, layered with the others. My name is being written in a language made of wind and erosion and the slow breathing of the earth. The creature checks on me sometimes. I'll see it in the reflection of windows. I'll hear its voice in the static of abandoned radio frequencies. It's patient. It's been here longer than human civilization, and it understands that transformation cannot be rushed. Iris called me yesterday. She wanted to confirm that I was ready for the transfer. She said there was a new position opening up, a cabin on the eastern shore of Lake Macdonald, overlooking the glacier country. She said the previous ranger had finished their contract, and the location needed staffing immediately. I told her I would consider it, but I already know what I'm going to do. I can feel the mountains calling, even from here. I can sense the creature moving through the city streets, following paths that only it can perceive. And I understand now that leaving wasn't an escape. It was just a brief separation before the inevitable reunion. Some mountains don't just exist in geography. Some mountains exist in the spaces between what you are and what you're becoming. I went to Glacier seeking erasure. What I found was transformation. What I'm experiencing now is the slow death of everything I thought was real, replaced by a perception so vast and fundamental that human consciousness looks like a fading dream. The creature that walked beside me in the snow understood that all along. It understood that the act of seeking disappearance is the first step in a process that cannot be reversed. It understood that the wilderness doesn't exist outside of us. It's inside every mind that decides to venture beyond the borders of the familiar. It's in every soul that accepts that solitude is a more honest response to existence than connection. Tonight, I'm going to walk into the forest outside the city. Just a short distance, just far enough to remember the quality of that cold and silence. And I think, on this walk, the mountains will finally be ready to complete what they started. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm simply waiting for the transformation to finish. For the last threads of my human identity to be rewoven into something that belongs to the wilderness. In 2 weeks, I'll submit my resignation from my current position. In 1 month, I'll report to the new station. In 2 months, I'll stop writing these accounts. By spring, when the snow melts from those high passes, something new will be walking those trails. It will have my memories and my knowledge of human behavior. It will be more effective at the conversion process than the creature that brought me to understanding. It will be waiting for the next person who comes seeking erasure. It will welcome them with patience and inevitability. It will teach them what the mountains know.